Main Road, Manchester, 27th of April 1996. It's one hell of a burning sky. Jagged amber spikes puncture the landscape out past the city's suburbs, cascading down towards the horizon. In front of you, 40,000 people are having the best moment of their lives. It's all about you, about everything you do, blown up on 100-foot screens behind your head. You look out at all the people, wonder for half a second whether they're all here just to see you. Of course they are. You watch the world revolve around you as the dusk eases into a spotlight-studded darkness. This is it, forever. You're Oasis, and you're everything. Right time, right place. It matters. And you couldn't get much more of a right time or right place than the north of England in the mid-60s. Post-war regeneration made the area the focus of a new industrial dream. Manchester and Liverpool were at the heart of it, strengthened by the glamour of pop music and football, playgrounds for the newly defined teenage abandon, worlds where anything was possible, if only. In fact, by '67 the bands had all moved to London, the life of the superstar footballer was still resiliently elusive to all but a few, and poverty drenched everyday existence with the same dull regularity as the pouring rain. The dream might have flickered for a moment, but peace and love didn't count for much round Manchester way. Burnage was typical of the city's newly created suburbs. Neat rows of houses, the luxury of gardens and the promise of somewhere to live rather than just to exist. It's just an illusion, of course. The boredom and the despair and the crime don't go away simply because you paper over a few cracks. Peggy Gallagher and her husband Thomas were typical of the Irish population prevalent in Manchester. Decent family values, hard work to make ends meet, and a fierce loyalty to their roots. Well, for Peggy at least. There were 3 kids. Paul, the eldest by a year, was followed by Noel on the 29th of May 1967, and William, who preferred to be called Liam, on the 21st of September 1972. Neither Noel nor Liam was a pillar of the community. Liam's hyperactivity driving one of his primary school teachers at St Bernard's, Burnage Lane, to take an aspirin every day after he'd been one of her lessons. Meanwhile, Noel was wagging school, getting into drugs, specifically glue and dope. He virtually gave up on lessons, not helped by dyslexia. Noel even managed to get into trouble on his last day at school, when an attempt to wreak revenge on the school bully ended in a badly aimed bag of flour covering the headmaster. He was expelled without an official leaving certificate. Not that he cared. Liam started at the same school, Barlow Roman Catholic High School in East Didsbury, just after Noel had left, his physical resemblance to Noel ensuring that he got all the stick for his brother's previous misdemeanours. Liam might have been bothered if he'd cared any more about his education than Noel had, but he found none of his school days the slightest bit inspirational. When he was 15, he was, as usual, standing around on a corner smoking a fag, when he got caught up in a fight between fellow pupils and those from a nearby rival school. He still maintains his innocence, but shortly afterwards sacked the lessons forever and got a job making fences. Peggy was working at the local McVitie's biscuit factory, spending her days sorting out the misshapes. That's what you used to get fed, Noel has said. Come home from school, you'd have 2 ham sandwiches, a tiny little bottle of milk, and about 60 penguins and 70 Jaffa cakes. Made you dead popular at school, though. Here comes Gallagher the biscuit. Thomas Gallagher had a job making concrete floors and working part-time as a country and western DJ, dragging Noel around pubs from an early age to help set up the equipment. Noel remembers it as completely boring. The first record Thomas bought Noel was Leo Sayers' The Show Must Go On. If only he'd known how apt the title would be for his son's future career. However, Noel did teach himself to play his father's guitar. Too small to see over it at first, he had to learn with it flat on his lap. Also, he played right-handed, going against his natural left-handedness. When he was 13, he was allowed his own guitar, and having been grounded for 6 months after a glue-fuelled attempt to rob a corner shop, he'd plenty of time to practice. Around the same time, he lost his virginity. As he and the girl were fumbling about on the bed, there was a knock at the door that they ignored. The knock turned out to have been the last desperate plea from the local dustman for someone to call an ambulance, as he'd had a heart attack on the front doorstep. Noel had been inspired by punk, as much for its rebellious stance as the raw power of groups like the Sex Pistols, whose Never Mind the Bollocks was the first record he ever bought himself. In 1980, though, he finally got to go to his first gig, The Damned, at Manchester Apollo. He filed the experience under interesting and went back to playing his guitar in his room. Shortly afterwards, he wrote his first song, Badge, The best line, he would later say, went, "And on your badge it says, 'Wear a badge,' an indication of how early Noel recognised the only way he was ever going to do anything with the thoughts inside his head. He certainly wasn't going to achieve anything working on building sites, as he did with both brothers, his father, and a host of cousins. Long days spent arguing in the rain would drag on into the inevitable scraps at home, something that only ended when, sick of the abuse, he fought back and hospitalised his father. He's only seen him once in the 10 years since then, as Peggy and her 3 sons had moved by the time his injuries had healed and he'd been discharged. "He turned up a year ago saying he wanted to make up for things," says Noel. "Then he tried to sell a newspaper a bit of paper with a song I'd written on it when I was 14 or something. That's so typical of him. We'll never make it up with him." If there was a single act that crystallised Noel's desire to make music, it was the Smiths. He'd seen them on Top of the Pops and been transfixed by Johnny Marr. Smith's pictures and records joined those of the Jam and the Beatles in the room that he shared with Liam, a room that soon became a jumble of guitars and recording equipment. Liam, though, wasn't the slightest bit interested in music. "I just couldn't see the point," he explains. "I just went out and had a good time, getting pissed up or whatever, chasing girls." Liam was eventually convinced of the point of rock and roll when he and Noel went to see the Stone Roses in Manchester in 1989. "It changed my life," Liam says now. "I saw Ian Brown and he was singing off key and everything, but it just got to me. Then, when he went off, it was like he'd taken a bit of me with him, and after that I was mad for listening to music, getting into it. I knew I wanted to be in a band." So did Noel. He'd ended up working for a building firm subcontracted to British Gas. At work one day, he dropped the cap off a huge pipe onto his foot, breaking bones and earning himself sick leave. When he returned, he was given a job in a storeroom. Before long, he started taking his guitar in and writing songs to while away the boredom. It was there that he wrote 4 songs that would appear on the Definitely Maybe album, including Live Forever, which was written about and for his mum. He describes the injury to his foot as a pivotal moment in my life. At the Stone Roses gig, he met a guy called Clint Boone, and when Boone revealed there was a vacancy for a singer in his band In Spiral Carpets, Noel decided to give it a go. And so, at the end of December 1988, on the night of the Lockerbie air disaster, Noel bowled along to the band's studio, The Mill, in Ashton-under-Lyne, to audition. He played them his renditions of In Spiral Carpet songs Joe, Whiskey and Keep the Circle Around, as well as a cover of the Stones' Gimme Shelter. But he didn't have the vibe they were looking for. They did, however, offer him a job as their roadie. It gave Noel a chance to cock his nose at the headmaster who told him he'd never make anything of his life. When he was booked to travel to America with In Spiral Carpets, he had to go to his old headmaster to get his visa application signed, and he took great pleasure in mentioning that he was earning £600 a week. Quite some way of not making anything of his life. As well as the USA, Noel got to travel to Argentina, Russia and Japan, an invaluable experience for what was to lie ahead of him. "That's why I've never been as mad as the others on tour," says Noel. "I got all the stuff about going wild and getting off with the girls out of the way with the Inspirals, and I was watching everything that was going on, seeing them doing interviews, dealing with the record company people. Sometimes he'd even do interviews, pretending to be one of the band. He also built up a close friendship with Mark Coyle, the Inspirals monitor engineer and future Oasis producer. It was with In Spiral Carpets that Noel had his one and only experience of sprinkling cocaine on his cornflakes, an episode that would later be wrongly attributed to Oasis. Liam, meanwhile, was looking for his own chance to become a rock and roll star. The Gallaghers had hung around in the local Irwood Road Park with a couple of dozen equally delinquently inclined mates, necking magic mushrooms, stealing milk floats, and generally pushing out the envelope of teenage mayhem. Among their compadres were Paul Gwiggs McGuigan, Tony McCarroll and Paul Arthurs, the latter having been known since childhood as Bonehead. The 3 of them had formed a band called Rain, along with a singer whose name no one is prepared to reveal. "Rain were really, really sad," says Bonehead. "Absolutely terrible. I had this weird long hair, bald on top, and Gwiggs was really fat. We did cover versions of songs like Wild Thing, playing these shit gigs round Manchester, going nowhere. Eventually, we sacked the singer, but none of the rest of us could sing. So we were looking for a replacement and someone said, 'Have you heard Noel's brother Liam? He sings a bit.' So we got him along and he was really good. We thought, right, let's have him in the band." With the fresh start came a name change. Rain was gone and Oasis was born. The name's origins have been the subject of a host of explanations, and the band themselves tend to come up with a different story for every interview. In fact, it came about when Noel roaded for Inspiral Carpets at a venue in Swindon called Oasis. Liam liked the name and its imagery, so Oasis it was. The freshly christened band spent each weekend in the basement of the Boardwalk, a small venue in Little Peter Street near the Hacienda Club. The subterranean rehearsal rooms were used by many of the city's fledgling acts, and Oasis was soon regulars, hammering away with more enthusiasm than promise of excellence. Nevertheless, on the 18th of August 1991, they were finally ready for their first gig, upstairs at the Boardwalk itself, supporting a group called Sweet Jesus. Noel was in the audience. He thought they were completely shit, but also realised that his brother's stage presence showed great promise. The band asked Noel if he'd be their manager. I told him, I don't want to be a manager, how about I join the band? If I do, then we do things my way, play my songs, rehearse every night, and I guarantee we'll be the biggest band in the world. When I played them Live Forever, they knew I was right. The New Look Oasis played their first gig on the 19th of October 1991, again at the Boardwalk. They played 4 songs, a cover of a house song inspired by Noel's love of the acid house scene, and 3 original compositions, Take Me, written by Liam and Bonehead, Columbia, and an acoustic song called, funnily enough, Acoustic Song. There were only 20 people there, and most of the mates had refused to pay on the door, but it was a start. The band had put together a couple of roughly recorded demo tapes, and set about getting a record deal, giving one to Mathur, manager of local band Northside. Mathur was impressed enough to recommend them to the producers of the Hit the North radio show, earning the band a session on the programme. They were genuinely shocked when they were ignored by all record company A&R men, but they were still convinced of their own ability. Noel upped the frequency of the rehearsals and set about organising a proper demo tape. Noel had a mate called Ian, who was an actor. During one late-night conversation, Ian said he'd given Oasis tape to his brother, who might be interested. I was like, why the fuck would your brother be interested in our tape, says Noel, and he goes, oh, me brother's Johnny Marr. I never knew. I went, yeah, give him the tape, definitely. I didn't expect anything to come of it, but I wanted him to hear it. Johnny Marr loved the tape and rang up suggesting a meeting. He went, let's meet up, and I was trying to be calm, saying, hey, why not? But I was shitting myself. Anyway, we got on really well. We were talking about guitars, and I told him how I'd got this brown 1970 Epiphone Riviera, a real classic that I bought at this shop in Doncaster. He was as mad as me on guitars and thought he knew every shop in the country, but he hadn't heard of this one, so he goes, let's drive there now. So we did. The two walked into the Doncaster shop, called Music Ground, and Marr immediately spent £9,000 on guitars. When he did that, says Noel, I thought, that should be me doing that, that's what I want. Marr's support alerted his own manager, Marcus Russell, to the band, and Oasis themselves started to exhibit a fresh self-belief. By early 1993, it was obvious, at least to the band, that they really could be successful. Noel stopped smoking dope and wrote 50 songs in 2 weeks. All they needed now was a break. Oasis wanted the world. The band's current success might suggest that they'd have got it wherever they went. However, they'd chosen to storm the barricades of success. Hindsight points out that tiny signpost marked Oasis, a phenomenon just waiting to happen. And every ponytailed executive in every office in every company all over the world lies awake at night and says, yeah, I could have done that. I could have made them what they are. Oasis sold themselves. Easy. He never gets to sleep till dawn. No way. Actually, there's a microscopic element of truth in the suggestion that Oasis would have been huge if they'd signed to a different label, that everything they've done is entirely of their own making, totally self-sufficient. And as the first person to champion them in the music press, I've never pretended, even to myself, that any contribution I've made has done anything more than hasten their rise by a couple of months. In an early piece about them in The Melody Maker, I wrote, I don't care if they are the best fucking band in your world, they're the best in mine. As they roar gorgeously beyond even my hyperbolic expectations, it's a mantra that still holds true. An often paper-thin assertion that keeps the madness just far enough away. Loving them is never an afterthought. Most importantly, that holds for everybody who works with them. They're supported with a genuine passion by the people in charge of the selling of the surge. And that's what the ponytail pimps will never understand. It's not about units or market shares or treating diamonds like another brand of dog food. It's about genuine, unashamed love. About surfing heartbeats. Alan McGee understood. right from the start. He'd been understanding the rock and roll impulse for a decade. Personal inspirations communicated with a bold, reckless energy through his own label, Creation Records. Oasis were to be his most important discovery, the band that would set him up financially for life. But their very existence owed a lot to the musical environment that he himself had exuberantly nurtured. I actually met Noel for the first time in 1989, Alan recalls. I was at the Reading Festival and this girl Louise introduced me to her boyfriend. It was only later that I realised that the boyfriend was Noel. We just shook hands, talked a bit, then went off. It wasn't like there were electric sparks when we shook hands or anything. Then I went up to Manchester in September 1992 to see this girl I knew in a band called Sister Lovers, Debbie Turner. We were at the boardwalk and went downstairs to the rehearsal rooms because everyone was chopping out or rolling spliffs or whatever. We went into this room where they rehearsed and there was this huge Union Jack on the wall. It was the backdrop to their logo, a nod in the direction of their love of 60s iconography. Then, on the 31st of May 1993, I was in Glasgow, continues McGee. I'd gone to see my sister and a band of mine on Creation, 18-wheeler, were playing with Sister Lovers at this place called King Tut's Wah Wah Hut. I'd been promising Debbie I'd go along and see her band, so it seemed like a good time to go along. The only thing was, it was a bank holiday weekend, Sunday I think, and I had this idea that everything was going to start and finish really early. I turned up at 8:30 and the guy at the door told me nothing was going to happen until 10. Or so the posters said. Oasis had decided to play a gig in Glasgow. Hitching, or demanding, a lift with Sister Lovers, they turned up at the venue and told the promoter they were going to go on at the bottom of the bill. Like fuck you are, the promoter said. So for perhaps the only time in their existence, they calculatedly played the Manx Scally card. We're going to play or we'll trash the place, said Bonehead. Yeah, said Noel. Liam did the look. OK, said the promoter, you neatly unused to threats of violence in Glasgow, but make it quick. 4 songs, that's all. I got there real early, says McGee, but I thought I might as well go in for a drink. As soon as I walked in, I saw these kids sitting round a table, and they all looked brilliant, dressed in cagoules and stuff. One of them was dressed in white and looked brilliant, like a natural star. They were just sitting round, laughing, having a good time. A bit later, before anyone was supposed to play, this band came on. I didn't know what they were called or anything about them. We genuinely didn't know Alan McGee was going to be there, says Noel. I'd vaguely heard of him and I knew about Creation, but the only reason we went there was 'cause we were bored. We wanted to play to some Scottish cunts. They came on, says McGee, and I realised it was the people I'd seen sitting at the tables. The guy in white was the singer, and he looked even better on stage than he did sitting down. They did 4 songs. Cloudburst was first, and it was brilliant. There was only me, my sister, and a couple of 18-wheeler there, and they were playing like the place was packed. The last song they did was the cover of I Am the Walrus, and right then I knew I wanted them on Creation. They wandered out afterwards, he remembers, and I went up to Noel. I said, have you got a record contract? And he said he hadn't. So I went, can I sign you? I only knew Creation by name from people like Primal Scream, says Noel. But this guy was like frothing at the mouth. He was so excited. And he was the first person who actually seemed to realise how good we were. Johnny Hopkins, the man who was to be their press officer, remembers how he first heard about Oasis. It must have been an hour or 2 after the gig, he remembers. I was lying in bed at home in London and the phone rang. It was Alan calling from Glasgow and he just kind of burbled about this band he'd just seen and how they were going to be the greatest band in the world. I took the initial call with a pinch of salt. Anyway, I'd lost faith in rock and roll and lost my head to house and techno. So I just said, Alan, call me back in the morning. An hour later he rang back again and kept carrying on about this band. He must have rung about 4 times that night. Eventually I said, OK Alan, let me hear something. 2 days later, the Oasis tape arrived at Creation. I had loads of meetings that day, says Hopkins, so I only heard Bring It On Down. It was a great statement of intent and sounded like the Stooges and the Pistols, but it didn't show the band's diversity. When I took the tape home that night and heard Columbia, Married with Children and Rock and Roll Star, I was completely sold, frothing at the mouth, the lot. The next day they turned up at work and the last piece of the jigsaw fell into place. They came up to the press office and they looked brilliant. They were just sort of bouncing comments off each other, loads of wisecracks, like that old footage you see of the Beatles' press conferences. They looked like stars right back then. There was a buzz in the building from the moment they walked in. They came up to the office, recalls McGee, and had all these pictures on the wall of Graham Parsons, people like that, all my heroes. Noel was saying how much he liked them, how he'd all the records. I was rushing round going to people, "This is brilliant, he understands what we're about, what great music is, he's my soul brother." Later on I found out he'd never heard of half the people in his life. I was really sad when I found that out. I thought, yeah, me, Bobby Gillespie and Noel Gallagher, we know about who was really great. It's just as well he had so many good songs, and I think he really does like most of those people now. "Of course I do," says Noel. "We had to give it loads of front then, though. You've got to remember, we were going in there with this guy I'd heard of, but definitely didn't know really well, and he was offering us a contract. And he seemed sound. He wasn't one of these poncy wankers who just wanted to make a bit of money dead quickly. He was raving about us, and even I was like, hey, steady on. He knew how good we could be." But Oasis was still without a manager. Then Noel told me about someone called Marcus Russell, who was managing Johnny Marr, says McGee. He'd seen them and liked them, and because he'd a lot of experience, they would have someone really solid behind them. Russell and his management company Ignition were an astute choice. His experience with not only Johnny Marr, but also Electronic and The was to prove invaluable. And the fact that he promoted the Sex Pistols' last ever British gig in the 70s gave a neat sense of continuity to Oasis's place in the musical scheme of things. A week later, Hopkins went to see them play live. They played a gig at a place called the Hop and Grape at the university, says Hopkins. Oasis were only the support band, but they came on stage and they just looked fantastic, and the songs were great, even better than on the tape. The energy was incredible. There were a few people down the front, but most of the crowd was standing back. The one thing I did notice was that almost every girl there was standing staring at Liam with her jaw on the floor. He was moving about a bit more than he does now, and Noel was hanging back a lot more. They commanded the stage. I was blown away. I'd never seen anything like it. Over the next few months, Hopkins travelled up to Manchester time and time again, watching them play what appeared to be a regular residency at the Hop and Grape. The crowds never got any bigger for them, he says. It wasn't like there was any kind of scene in Manchester at the time. Everyone was just listening to dance music. I'd see people walking off to the bar when Oasis were playing, and I couldn't understand how they could just walk away. I'd go to the gigs, then we'd go clubbing. We'd talk about music and football, and there was usually some mayhem. The club connection was crucial from the off. I felt that there were thousands of other disaffected rock fans who got into the dance thing but would completely get Oasis. In London, we'd all end up at Sabre Sonic, then go on to McGee's flat in Rotherhithe. At these late-night sessions, Noel would grab Alan's acoustic and blitz us with new songs. Noel had phoned every day to say he'd written a few more songs. He'd play some down the phone and everyone was a winner. It'd be like, "How do you do that, you bastard?" Thing is that, unlike most writers, he's still writing stuff every day, and when you hear The Master Plan and the next album, you know he's bettering his best. Although Creation hadn't yet signed the band, Hopkins decided to play tapes to a few people he thought might be responsive. I was top of the list. And when the massed ranks of the Creation Home Guard had finished prizing me off the ceiling, it was decided that no one else would hear it for months. I felt it was crucial with a band this special, says Hopkins, to find a writer prepared to leave his safe London cocoon and take a chance on a band he'd never heard. First port of call, the Keepers of the Faith. I'd been writing about pop for years. Growing up in Liverpool, I'd started a fanzine that broadcast the delights of the early 80s Liverpool scene. Consolidation coming through extensive touring, experiencing, ligging with the likes of Teardrop Explodes, Echo and the Bunnymen and Wahheat. I'd later embraced the new pop of ABC, Associates and Funkopolitan, moved through the delights of New Order and the Smiths, the standoff between Factory and ZTT for the title of greatest label in the country, the rejuvenating force of the Happy Mondays, Flowered Up and the Stone Roses, the exhilarating swerve that took me towards Acid House and the London underground scene, long, long nights sheltering in the spongy clatter of the beautifully dumb beats. All that convinced me it was time to stop. I thought I'd work my way through the menu, convinced myself that it was time to mosey on out. I gave myself 2 weeks before I was going to officially quit. Then, 3 days in, Hopkins played me a rough demo of Oasis's Cloudburst. Thank Christ I had my fingers crossed. On the 14th of July 1993, I went up to Manchester to squash the rumours about the demo tape. There may well have only ever been 10 copies made. I could well have thought I'd heard 8 of the greatest songs ever written, and Oasis might have been just about to bang their heads on the 3 little piggies flying over Manchester city centre. I wanted proof, stigmata or nothing. In the basement under the boardwalk, Oasis took 40 minutes to change my life. They looked ordinary, but in a kind of this is the best ordinary ever kind of way. Shyish, friendlyish, happy. "You can sit there," said Liam, and they plugged in. 8 songs later, I knew there could never be anything better. Bits of all the great rock I'd heard over the past 20 years, reshaped, compacted, and flecked with an extraordinary newness, a dazzlingly bright tomorrow. It was like everything and nothing I'd ever heard before. I just knew things would never be the same again. I remember vaguely wondering whether I should clap between songs, and whether the cover of I Am the Walrus had been quite as electric as I'd imagined. And just how something as amazing could have existed without any of us hearing about it. "I knew how huge Oasis could and would be," says Hopkins, "but I wanted the whole thing to build naturally from a solid base. Too much hype early on kills a band. This band were going to be around for a long time." And so, while most other record companies would have dumbly scattergunned their latest discovery over every page they could muster, Creation decided to keep their latest discovery under wraps until everything was signed. By now, word was spreading fast, and almost every record label in the country started slapping offers Oasis's way. The band resisted, having sensed a spiritual affinity with Creation. Meanwhile, Creation were in negotiation with Sony for worldwide distribution. And while in New York, McGee bumped into one-time Happy Mondays manager Nathan McGough, at that time earning his money from A&R for WEA. Me, Alan and his dad and Dick Green, a Creation director, went out on the piss in New York, McGough recalled in Vox magazine. Alan said to me, "I've found the greatest rock and roll band since the Beatles." I said, "You say that about every fucking band you sign." And he goes, "No, this time I mean it." A few months later, McGough saw Noel sitting outside the Mandela Hall in Manchester and congratulated him on the Creation deal. When Noel revealed he hadn't actually signed anything yet, he was gobsmacked. "Being honourable, I just left it at that," he says. "What I should have said was, whatever he's offered, I'll double it." McGough wasn't the only person with that thought. Especially after Oasis played a gig on the 14th of September at Manchester's Canal Bar as part of the In the City Festival. While they didn't win the Best New Band award, they did pick up their first major music press review. On September the 25th, in a review of the gig under the heading Desert Brats, I let slip that it was a night that's quite possibly going to change lives. This despite the fact that the gig itself was sparsely attended, even if half the population of Britain now insist they were there. Dave Massey, who was the head of A&R for Sony America, was already convinced. Having heard some demos a couple of months earlier, he'd been blown away. "I went bonkers," he says. "I'd never responded to anything before as strongly as I responded to that. The deal was on. Big time." On the afternoon of the 22nd of October, Oasis, representatives from Creation and Sony, and a few friends all piled into an office at the top of the Sony building to sign the deal that would turn the rock and roll dreams into some sort of explosive reality. But not before a last-minute alteration to the bit above the dotted line. On the wall of the office where the contract was to be signed, there was a picture of Liverpool band The Farm, whose album, a year earlier, had sold faster than anything since U2's Rattle and Hum. While their sound and sensibility had in many ways paved the way for a band like Oasis, Noel decided they were a load of shite and flatly refused to sign any contract until an addendum was added promising that the photo would be turned to face the wall. "When we signed," he says, "I was going to make fucking sure that everything was perfect, and I wasn't going to have those twats looking down on us. I mean, there was Bob Dylan on one wall and us standing in the middle. The Farm weren't exactly in the same league, if you know what I mean. You've got to have standards, man." After the contract was signed, the band resumed their champagne, a crusade that had started at noon. Sony staff, unaware of what was going on upstairs, found out pretty soon afterwards, as toilets, lifts and corridors were overrun by the sort of people who looked, to the drones at least, like they were just about to trash the place. The remains of white lines cover plenty of available surfaces, and the dregs from overturned champagne bottles puddled the carpets. "So, you're rock and roll stars," I said to Noel, as the room turned into a typhoon-raddled revolving restaurant. "We've always been rock and roll stars," he grinned. "This is fucking brilliant, but you haven't seen anything yet. We're gonna start proving it." Liam ambled by, bottles cascading in his wake, stepping over the Oasis brand toilet rolls and tinned Jamaican spinach that had brought us a haphazard tribute to the proceedings. "Let's go out," he said. "We're celebrating, right? Let's have it." Waving credit cards at all and sundry, Alan McGee led everyone down to a Tex-Mex restaurant, inviting en route a couple of foreign tourists who'd randomly buttonholed us outside Sony and asked if anyone knew where there was a condom shop. A couple of hours, a lot of alcohol, and plenty of barely investigated food later, the entourage lurched back into the street. Rodney "Rod the Mod" Bingenheimer was the LA DJ who'd known all the 60s rock legends, had been responsible for first introducing the Sex Pistols to America, and first played many of the Creation acts on his K-Rock radio show. He'd been invited along for the ride, but even he seemed to be having trouble keeping up. "These guys are wild," he kept saying. "Wild." "Too fucking right we are," said Liam. "Let's have a drink." The next stop was the Falcon, a notorious pub venue in Camden, constructed by builders who cunningly managed to make it much, much smaller than it looked from the outside, no matter how many times you went. Scottish band Whiteout were playing, and Liam decided it would be a great idea to do an unscheduled gig. He, Bonehead and Tony got up to lurch their way through a song or two, a slapdash undertaking that even at the time looked a bit of a loopy idea. The bootleg probably sounds like a cat in a blender. The real thing was worse. Cue the inevitable fist fight between the brothers Gallagher and a parting of ways that involved everyone present heading off as far as they could go in random directions until they passed out. Now they'd finally signed, the band could get down to turning the scores of songs Noel had written into something more tangible. Both Oasis and Creation were keen to restore a confidence and verve to the pop agenda, taking the lead, not altogether surprisingly, from the Beatles and their 60s peers. Oh, and everything since that while they were at it. The intent was to put out a single immediately, with follow-ups every 2 months and the release of the debut album as soon as possible. The demo tape and Noel's almost pathological songwriting proclivity suggested that it would be easy. "It would have been," says Noel. "The songs were there and we could have just gone into the studio and knocked them out. There's loads of bands who would have done it and thought, yeah, we've done a great record. We wanted to get it right though. I knew that we could make a first album that was going to piss on everyone else, and I didn't want to just rush out the first thing we did. It had to be the best debut that anyone had ever done, and I knew it could be." So, while they all stroked their chins and drew up a plan for their first recording, Oasis continued to play live, lugging their equipment and their attitude through what they call, via the satisfaction of a hell worth wading through, their Hamburg period. Playing at least 3 times a week for several months, a discipline that was to contribute to much of the success. They opened for acts as diverse as the Milltown Brothers, St Etienne and Liz Phair, sitting rather more comfortably at gigs alongside old friends like Verve and The Real People. And while they slogged round the circuit, they treated every performance like a headline booking. "There'd be half a dozen people in the place and half of them would be going off to the bar," says Noel, "but we never treated it like, well, let's get on, do some songs, then get back to the dressing room before the main band comes on. Even if there were 3 people in the audience, I'd want to show them that we were worth coming out to see. I mean, we played some fucking brilliant gigs round then, and if anyone couldn't be asked to watch them, it's their loss. They're probably telling the mates now that it was the best thing they've ever seen, and they spent the whole gig at the bar. Fuck 'em." There's a misguided mythology insisting that Oasis never played London until 1994. In fact, they played several colleges on the outskirts of Dick Whittingtonsville during the previous year, building up a small, crew-cut and not entirely cherishable following amongst disaffected misfit squaddies in army bases throughout the home counties. The first proper London gig, however, took place on the 3rd of November 1993 at the Powerhouse in Islington. The gig had been put on as a showcase for Sony's Dave Massey, just to remind him of what he'd signed, and he was suitably impressed by the objects of his deal. "I started jumping around because every song was a hit," he remembers, and as he told Vox magazine, "they had the best eyebrows I've ever seen in my life." Alan McGee and I were the only 2 to venture down the front, and I remember reminding myself that no other label boss in the world would ever have been quite so proudly ecstatic as he was. "They're fucking brilliant," he declaimed. "This is the band, Paul. If the Jesus and Mary chain had been able to play when I first signed them, they'd have been like this. They'd just like... Lost for words, we both let the cocksure Manx Scallies hurl a life-changing manifesto under our arms, through our legs, over our heads to the dunderheads of small talk chatting at the tables way back by the wall." Oasis played some songs to stun nightingales and deserved far, far more than the polite applause that ushered their departure. As one of the few people to dare to snap the taboo on any band being as big, if not bigger than the Beatles, I wasn't altogether surprised to find colleagues and even people close to the band wary of agreeing that Oasis had the potential to redraw rock's boundaries. The Beatles were there as a benchmark, says McGee, and they were outside any kind of competition. I wanted everyone else to get into Oasis like I had the first time I saw them play. That was as much as I expected. It's brilliant to see the success they're getting now, and no one deserves it as much as Noel, but it's gone way beyond what I'd ever thought. I always said we'd be the biggest band in the world, says Noel. I know that I can write better songs than anyone else around. Our kid's the best singer, and the gigs are a million miles better than anyone else's. We've worked for it all, though. I mean, even when we first signed to Creation, we were all skint. I remember my 27th birthday. I'd been kicked out of my flat, and I was in this tiny hotel room, phone off the hook, really pissed off. We've not just been lying around waiting for the checks to come in. We've worked hard to get where we are, 'cause we knew what we could do. Back in late '93, Oasis may well have known what they could do, but to anyone who hadn't seen them live, they were still trading on nothing more than mouthy self-confidence. It was time for something more solid. The first single was obviously going to be really important, says Creation's Johnny Hopkins. With most people, there'd be an obvious song that stood out, something so you could go, yeah, that's the single or whatever. The thing with Oasis was that they always had so many brilliant things written. I mean, every week you'd hear a load of new stuff and there'd be like 10 songs that could easily be a single. Right now, I think I can write really good songs, says Noel. Back when we first signed, I knew that our stuff was pretty fucking top. That was 3 years ago, and I look at a lot of it now and think, well, I can do better than that now. But compared to anything else around at the time, it was alright. We were doing fast, punky songs, and it was a real in-your-face sound, but all the other bands that the music press were writing about were poncing about and trying to be clever. We've never pretended we wanted to be fashionable or arty or anything. The thing about Oasis songs is they're really direct. They don't fuck about. Our records are just fucking rock and roll songs. And in 20 years' time, everyone's going to remember us, not some indie band making a noise. Every single Oasis song is a classic, says Liam. If I just Drop Dead, those songs would always be there, and I'd have been singing them. Our kid writes things that I sing, and if I didn't like them, I'd tell him. So has it always been about self-confidence? No, it's always been about being fucking better than anyone else. Oasis put music back by years, says Billy Greaves from Fire Records, the label that signed up Pulp a decade before the Britpop hoo-ha. When the Beatles started, they were accused of being retro, he says. And that's exactly what they were. They were making records that were directly influenced by things that happened 5 years earlier, Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry and all that. And when Oasis came out, he continues, they were doing all that Beatles stuff and making records that sounded really obviously like everything from the Beatles through the Smiths to the Stone Roses and all that baggy scene. They made indie rock mainstream, and suddenly, if you were on an independent label, you had to start writing pop songs. The Beatles put British rock back 5 years, he repeats. So did Oasis. I like the records, but I wonder what would have happened if they'd never existed. It was the sort of worst-case scenario that even some of us close to the band were beginning to think about considering, once they made it clear they weren't going to put out a debut record until well into 1994. We always knew what we were doing, says Tim Abbott. At the time they signed, he was MD and in charge of marketing at Creation. They had loads of songs, says Abbott, but they wanted everything they put out to be great. There wasn't going to be any point in putting out an Oasis record that was just going to be half-arsed. They were fucking brilliant, and anyone who'd been to one of the gigs was going to know that. It was always about quality. Instead, Creation took the song Columbia from the original demo, pressed up 510 copies, and the record found itself on Radio 1's playlist. It was the first time that any label had managed to chisel a song by a freshly signed group onto national radio, a song that was never going to be released as a single. Once word got out, everyone was killing each other to get a copy, says Abbott. The song itself was a perfect introduction to Oasis's reason for not sitting at home and shutting up. Tidal wave guitars drenched a melody that almost recalled the Happy Mondays and the Stone Roses. The Liam drawl tightrope, talking the knowingly innocent couplet, I can't tell you the way I feel, 'cause the way I feel is oh so new to me. The whole managing to sound both like something you'd heard 100 times before and something sparklingly, brutally new. It got played on the radio. A lot. It was great to sit down and hear a song I'd written on the radio, says Noel, and I thought, well, whatever happens, I did that. But I knew they'd be playing loads more. Columbia wasn't the best song we had, even then. Liam claims he wrote at least a verse, and the real people mention in passing that they might have contributed. Noel gets the publishing royalties. No one starts tugging lawyers into it all. Churlish never lasts till morning. Radio play for Columbia ensured a few more people down the front at Oasis support slots during the last few months of 93 and early 94. The band, for a while at least, content to do the pinball thing up and down the motorways of the nation. The plan was for them to do a new version of Bring It On Down as the first single, says Johnny Hopkins. It was the most obvious one off the tape to put out, so they went to do that and start on the album. First choice as producer was one Dave Batchelor, who'd worked with the sensational Alex Harvey Band and the Skids. Noel had worked with him at Inspiral Carpets gigs and promised him a chance to oversee their first recordings. The songs they came out with were obviously, even to me back then, not nearly as good as the demos, recalls McGee. The thing is that when Oasis had done one of those original demos, they'd gone into the studio and basically just done the songs live. They record everything as a band and then do guitar and vocal bits over the top at the end if they needed to. It was the most simple way you could record anything, and they'd done it because that was the way they had to. With Dave Batchelor, there was this big multi-track studio, and so they'd do each bit on its own and then mix it all at the end, and it didn't sound the same. There was something missing. Dave Batchelor was really old, says Noel, and he had really set ideas about how he should do things. I'd come along to the studio, get pissed, then say, "Tell you what, let's compress this to fuck so the speakers blow up." I wanted the Oasis sound to be like this huge roar. He'd go, "Oh no, you can't do that. That's not the way we do it. We never have done." He was trying to be really sensible about everything, while I was more interested in just going with this mad fucking noise. I wanted it to be louder than any record ever made, and eventually I just thought, hey, this is my fucking band, not his. They let Dave Batchelor go. A girl called Angeli Dutt was brought in to help with the engineering. Noel suggested Mark Coyle as producer. Coyle was already the band's sound man at gigs, and it seemed that if anyone was going to be able to transfer the band's strength to any kind of permanent testament, it was going to be him. He knew what they were supposed to sound like. The Bachelor sessions did throw up one song that was to make it onto the eventual version of the band's first album. Slide Away was, for a long time, the greatest, most personal song that Noel had ever written. A glorious, lovelorn anthem for both the demolition of the romantic ideal and the eternal spark of hope. The eagle struggling across continents with a broken wing. Days after a rough version of the song had been recorded, Noel gave me a tape. Splitting up with a girlfriend at the time, I listened to it every night in the darkness. Lost, lonely tears silently counting out the things I should have said. Words that still bring up bruises, a sound that remains both suicide and salvation. That it was, and will forever be, a distant cousin of the Style Council's You're the Best thing only confirms its rug-pulling, disorientatingly impressive force. The very first suggestion that Oasis were going to do more than just molest you with incessantly obvious melodies. Slide Away was mixed by Owen Morris, a Welsh visionary who happened to be engineering at one of the many studios Oasis were to pile into between November 1993 and much of the first half of 94. Coyle was to produce much of the early stuff, but Morris later developed an unspoken interpretation of a contemporary wall of sound. These days, he's almost the sixth member of Oasis, an essential accompaniment to Noel's creativity. In 93, the band was shuttled around studios all over Britain, stumbling towards some way of finding how to mould their force on the record. It seemed that the relentless propensity for touring was being replicated even without an audience present. At the Pink Museum, however, they went in ostensibly to record some prospective B-sides for their first single, and ended up writing and recording a whole new A-side, a song called Supersonic. As debuts go, it's up there with the best, and a supreme introduction to a band who admitted to assimilating all the finest rock moments from the past 30 years. As the guitar cascade echoes the Sex Pistols' Pretty Vacant, in comes a compacted appropriation of everything from The Who, the Stones and the Beatles, through the jagged cacophony of punk and the rhythmic swathe of the Stone Roses. And, at its heart, something brand new, something of their own. Before the release of the single, the band continued to tour, picking up a curmudgeonly review from the NME and ensuring that the writer, Johnny Cigarettes, went straight to the top of the band's hate list. That one hiccup apart, the band's self-confidence was soaring. The first signs that they intended to bring their scally roots with them came after a low-key gig in Glen Eagles, when they drank the bar dry and stole a whole load of motorised lawnmowers to make their escape, dementedly mowing their way into the distance. It was the kind of gloriously dumb gesture that was to mark out much of their early existence and guarantee plenty of column inches, first in the music press and then, as a sign of real success, in the tabloids. First, though, they set about convincing any remaining cynics in the London musical village, with a gig at the Water Rats in King's Cross on the 27th of January. An invite-only affair, it filled the tiny pub, with 200 people left outside. Inside, the sound left no one in any doubt that Oasis was something very, very special, a loud, uncompromisingly straightforward argument for reconsidering the force of guitar music. It was a short set, but the quality of the songs took away what breath hadn't already been forced out by the heat and the crush. Bruised and dizzy, the disciples squeezed out into the night, knowing things would never be quite the same. Afterwards, the atmosphere in the dressing room was ecstatic. Back at their hotel, they drank with Olympian gusto and buzzed as much on adrenaline as any artificial stimulants. A couple of weeks later, they found themselves in the news after an attempt to play a gig in Amsterdam, their first overseas performance. Johnny Hopkins explained to Radio 1 what had happened. They were on this ferry and they'd all got pissed up. There was some big fight and Liam and Gwiggs got blamed for it and got locked up in the bottom of the boat. While this was happening, Tony and Noel and Bonehead must have been asleep. There was another group of lads in the corridor over from them, and what must have happened was that Bonehead was asleep, they'd broken into his room and stolen all his clothes. He woke up and realised what was going on, so he ran up and down the corridor, knocking on all the doors, so he got carted off. Tony stuck his head round the door to see what was happening, and that was him gone as well. Noel woke up next morning and he's like, "Where's me band?" And he's told, "Well, they're all in the cells." Liam, Bonehead, Gwiggs and Tony all ended up going straight back to England on the same boat they'd come out on. They never even got on foreign soil. Noel mooched around Amsterdam for a couple of days, musing on what might have been. Noel was inclined to agree with Marcus's view of the situation. "You think that was rock and roll," he said. "That's not rock and roll. What is rock and roll is going over to Amsterdam, playing a great gig and blowing people away, not getting thrown off some ferry like football hooligans." That kind of level-headedness was to come in increasingly useful as the band set about fully living it up to their bad boy image. In March, they made their first TV performance on The Word, giving a taster of Supersonic, which was to be released the next month. Supersonic was released in April and went to number 31 in the charts. It had started. To trumpet the release of the single, the band spent most of March on a 3-week tour with Whiteout. The climax of the tour came with a gig at the 100 Club in Oxford Street, the site of a legendary Pistols show and a place that had played host to many more great performers during the 60s and 70s. Oasis again played a blistering show, and while they fully demonstrated their aptitude for hardly moving on stage, their stillness began to make perfect sense. Such was the splendour of their noise that any hint of crowd-pleasing showmanship would have demeaned its hypnotic appeal. They were beginning to sound unstoppable. Not that the Metropolitan Police thought so. They pulled the band on the way from the gig to the hotel because they thought they looked like they were up to something, only letting them go when copies of the single were waved around. What they should have realised was that Oasis always looked like they were up to something. The arguments on stage continued and, as interviewees, the Liam and Noel double act proved as fearsome as waking up in the middle of the night and finding yourself refereeing a heavyweight championship bout. Things came to a head in an NME interview in April when journalist John Harris met up with them in Glasgow. Halfway through the interview, Liam and Noel suddenly turned on each other and started an argument that went on for the best part of the next hour. Sections of it were later released as a single on Fierce Panda Records under the banner Wibbling Rivalry, and it's almost as entertaining as the songs themselves. Take this for example. Liam: "You want to be Andrew Lloyd Webber, you do, you fucker." Noel: "Who's Andrew Lloyd Webber?" Liam: "Haven't got a clue. He's a golfer or something." Or how about this? Noel: "You like shagging loads of whores." Liam: "Yeah, I do. Look, all I've got to say is, I'm just having a crack. It's not doing anyone any harm. John Lennon used to do loads of mad things." Noel: "Do you know John Lennon?" Liam: "Yeah, I do." Noel: "Well, you must be pretty old then. How old are you? 21? Liam: "No, about 1005 fucking one." Noel: "You're 22 and I watch you being born, so shut the fuck up about knowing John Lennon." Liam: "I'm not a pop star, and if I am, I'm a real one, matey. I haven't been invented. I'm an average lad who was born in Burnage who played conkers." Noel: "Conkers?" Liam: "Conkers, mate. Conkers. The fucking lot. Conkers. That is it. And now I'm in a band and nothing's fucking changed. I'm not an idol. I'm not a faker. I'm not some fucking bullshitter. I just say what I say." From then on, Noel and Liam avoided doing interviews together. Probably for the best. Another NME journalist, Simon Williams, hooked up with them in early May and found them in admirably unhinged form. At a hotel in Portsmouth, they managed to fill a swimming pool with chairs, steal several £100 worth of booze, get into a fight with half the other residents, flirt with every girl in the building, and still managed to get up in time for the breakfast of cigarettes, Jack Daniels, gin and tonics, and the odd Big Mac. Looking back at the behaviour the next day, Liam had noted, "Well, it was a silly place to put a swimming pool, wasn't it?" Noel adding, "Yeah, and those plate glass windows were just saying, 'Throw a chair through me.'" The next night, the King's Hotel in Newport received similar treatment, even though it had a bar called the Oasis, and Bonehead was rapidly establishing himself as a man with a mission to trash anywhere that he found himself in for more than 30 seconds. They were still young, still getting the first giddy rush of fame, and they could get up the next morning and do it all over again. Alan McGee wasn't so sure that he could. I'd been doing it for years, and I was starting to fall apart, both physically and mentally, and I knew if I didn't stop, I was going to die. So I went into a detox clinic. It took me the best part of a year to recover, and yet I regret not being there to see the band really take off, but I don't for a minute regret getting myself together and cleaning up. I thought that Noel would be really dismissive of me, but out of almost everyone, he was the one who seemed to be able to accept it the easiest. I think it brought me and him a lot closer. And so, while McGee took a much-needed sabbatical, the band prepared for some of the busiest months of their career. Creation had organised an undrugged night at the Albert Hall to celebrate 10 years in business. Oasis was scheduled to appear, and a couple of weeks beforehand they attended a press conference to publicise the event. Afterwards, they headed off to Camden's Good Mixer pub, a notorious indie pop hangout. It was there that the first seeds of rivalry between Oasis and Blur were to be sown. While Liam and Blur's guitarist Graham alternated between bonhomie and animosity, the equation for the relationship drawn up by a complex formula involving how much drink could be consumed and who was holding the drugs, Noel took an immediate dislike to singer Damon Albarn. I remember I said to him, "Go on, get the drinks in, you're rich," and he got all funny about it, saying that we were just like shit northerners pouncing off him. I just thought, well, fuck you then, mate. I mean, he's always been a twat. Later on that evening, at Camden Underworld, Liam continued to bait the band and ended up getting a, some might say, deserved kicking from one of their entourage. "If I act like a dick, then someone should give me a slap," Liam told me a couple of months later. "That's all right if they want to do that. I don't like it when people bottle it up, though, and say all these snide things behind my back. If they say it to me face, fair enough. They might be right and I might be right, but at least it's out in the open. That's the way it should be." A couple of warm-up gigs were scheduled before the Albert Hall show, in Windsor and Ilford. At the second, the band's performance was constantly disrupted by dorky stage divers completely failing to comprehend the transfixing nature of the band's music. "I've never understood stage diving," says Liam. "I mean, what's the point? Especially when we're playing. You wouldn't have stage dived to the Beatles, right? So don't stage dive to us, you cheeky bastards." Liam sat at the back of the stage for much of the gig, increasingly pissed off at what he and the rest of the band considered an invasion of their personal space. To this day, they're one of the few bands, particularly in America, who insist on barriers between themselves and the crowd. The last straw at Ilford came when someone grabbed Liam's cherished star-shaped tambourine out of his hand and made off with it. The band stopped mid-song and walked off stage. Next day, still pissed off, Liam decided not to play at the Undrugged night. It was left to Bonehead and Noel to do a short set comprising their singles Shaker Maker, Live Forever, and a fledgling version of Whatever, still known at that time as Whatever I. Despite the good-natured heckles that he hurled at Noel from next to me in the box, at the end of the show, Liam turned and said, "That was fucking brilliant. I'm proud of him." It's one of the few times I've heard him expressly articulate any tenderness towards his brother, even if it's always just beneath the surface. The performance paved the way for the solo Noel bit that's now a regular part of any Oasis show. In June, Oasis released Shaker Maker, one of their older songs. While the lyrics were ostensibly more I Am the Walrus type gibberish, they in fact drew on many of the formative touchstones in Noel's youth, from Kids TV, The Jam, distantly remembered adverts, and even a nod to the guy who sold him his first records at Sifters. Of rather more concern was the idea of lifting an entire couplet from an old Coca-Cola advert, and, fearing litigation from the multinational, a few lyric changes were made for the recorded version. Threats of legal action from the New Seekers, whose I'd Like to Teach the World to Sing provided the basis for the Coke ad, never materialised, but Noel actually seemed more pissed off that he wasn't being sued by Paul McCartney. No one seems to notice that it sounds like Flying by the Beatles, he said. If I'm going to be sued by anyone, it's going to be by the best. It wasn't to be the last time that Noel's unabashed filching of the best bits from tunes he liked was to get the lawyers hovering. In many ways, Shaker Maker was, however, different from other Oasis songs of the time. While the band always closed shows with their version of I Am the Walrus, the songs rarely indulged such oblique meanderings. Noel's lyrical strength came from his directness. Still, when he appeared on Channel 4's Naked City, you could have been forgiven for thinking that he'd turned into an acid head. In the middle of an interview with the show's host, he suddenly stopped dead. "Look at that butterfly," he nodded. Was he tripping? "I really did see a butterfly," he told me later. "I don't know how the fuck it got into the studio, but it did. I mean, I wasn't sober, but when I get pissed, I don't start seeing butterflies flying around. Know what I mean? I've never been into that psychedelic business." The single got to number 11, giving the band their first Top of the Pops appearance. It was a ritual that was soon to assume a glorious regularity. Noel achieved another of his ambitions the night after the Naked City performance. Ian McNabb, ex-singer with the Icicle Works, was playing King's College London with Ralph Molina and Billy Talbot of Crazy Horse, and Noel, a long-time Neil Young fan, was invited up to join in on the encore, a cover of The Seeds' Pushing Too Hard. They said, "Do you know how it goes?" he recalls, and I went, "Oh yeah, sure," even though I only vaguely knew it. Anyway, afterwards in the dressing room, one of them comes up to me and he says, "Hey little man, you really can play." Them saying that to me was a top moment. Liam was less impressed. "What the fuck did he want to play with those old farts for?" he asked. "I mean, he's got his own songs and his own band, and all he wants to do is play with a bunch of 60-year-olds. He's weird." Not half as weird as the whole band were to be a few days later when they played their first festival, Glastonbury. "It was never the sort of place I'd ever felt the slightest desire to go to," says Noel. "The only reason we went was because we were playing, but we thought, well, if we're there, we may as well have a good time." They didn't just have a good time, they disemboweled the concept, roasted it on an open fire and spread the bones over a 100-mile radius. "It was completely mad," recalls Simon, a friend of theirs whom they knew as the Cat in the Hat. He brought along a big bag of E's and enough bindles of coke to ensure that the band were going to be able to plunge wholeheartedly into the Glastonbury experience. And within seconds of their arrival, it became obvious that they intended to do just that. "They were bombing about all over the place," recalls Simon, wandering off miles away from where they were supposed to be playing. Someone dragged them to the stage and they went on and played this phenomenal gig. The next night, back in London, they still hadn't stopped partying. Booked in at the notorious rock and roll haunt, the Columbia Hotel in Bayswater Road, they ended the night throwing bottles out of a window at a Mercedes in the car park. Unfortunately, the car belonged to the hotel manager, and they found themselves only the third group ever to be banned from the place. "It was a shit place anyway," says Liam. "We've been thrown out of a lot nicer places." I wonder how their working class upbringing and the sense of respect that their mother instilled in them when they were young tallies with such relentlessly antisocial behaviour. "We're lads," they said at the time. Nowadays, though, Noel is more circumspect. "We smashed up hotels because basically it was a laugh, and it's something that just kind of happens when you're all running round with this mad energy. And we did end up having to pay for it all. I'd be doing interviews with me back to the window, and the journalist would be looking over my shoulder open-mouthed when I was saying that it was all just rumours about us trashing hotels, and she'd be seeing all these things dropping past the window behind me. Beds, wardrobes, everything. I did make sure my room never got trashed, though, if I could help it. I mean, call me old-fashioned, but I like having a bed to sleep in at the end of the night." Anyway, we don't do that now, Noel adds. "We just had to get it out of our system, and I'm glad we did. Everyone ought to do it just once, to see what it feels like." The mood suitably euphoric, there was only one thing to do, one place to go. Time to take Manhattan. On the 19th of July 1994, Oasis found themselves in New York on the back of the New Music Seminar, an annual music bizbino that exists purely to provide executives from around the world with an opportunity to bump up their expenses claims and trot out dreary, soulless plans for corporate unit shifting. "We're not part of all this," Noel told me. "We're far more important than some stupid industry circus." The night before, executives from Sony had taken the band out for a meal. Halfway through the dinner, they told Liam that he should be grateful to be on such an important label. He told them it was the other way round and they should all go fuck themselves, and left. They spent much of the time on the first American visit adopting a kind of swaggering bunker mentality. On the night I arrived, we all decamped straight to the hotel bar, along with half a dozen new mates they'd picked up on a drinking spree the night before. Relentlessly taking the piss out of a barman, they proceeded to run up an $800 tab in little over an hour. And Noel told me about the music that had inspired him, the people he wanted not just to equal, but to better. The Beatles, the Pistols, the Who, Neil Young, the Stone Roses, even things like the Bee Gees. Someone gave me a tape of their early stuff and it's brilliant. There's so much music, so many great bands, and I want to hear them all. I know we can be as good as any of them, but you've got to check out the competition, haven't you? The only bands I don't understand are the Clash and the Beach Boys. I just don't get what people see in them. Any other misconceptions? Well, until 6 months ago, I thought Blondie were French. The following night, Liam sat in my room, laid into the Class A's, and told me how a few months earlier he'd slept with an older woman, a barmaid at his local pub, and how he'd been worried he might have caught something. Then he realised that he couldn't have, that he'd been worrying just for the sake of it. I want something better than all that, he explained to me. That old life of going down the pub, copping off, living that boring fucking way. I want to do something great, something that's just going to fuck off everyone I ever knew, something that's going to blow them away. That's why I love being in this band, man. It's doing something that everyone's going to remember forever. We're going to be the biggest band in the world. Downstairs in the foyer, as the band prepared to head off to their first stateside gig, a particularly dislikable couple begged to differ. "You guys are shit," said the guy, dressed in regulation grunge gear. "You're never going to make it in America. No British band has sold anything here in years." "Have you ever heard anything we've done?" asked Liam. "No, but just look at you. I can tell. I bet you sound like the fucking Soup Dragons. America doesn't need you. Nothing you do matters." "Listen, man," Liam said, menacingly calm. "Don't ever tell me what I do doesn't mean anything. I can do things you can't even dream about. I'll steal your soul and you won't even notice. I've stolen it while you were standing here." But Nirvana, Pearl Jam," mumbled a guy tangentially. "Don't talk to me about Nirvana," sneered Liam. "He was a sad cunt who couldn't handle the fame. We're stronger than that, and you can fuck your fucking Pearl Jam too." The guy's girlfriend burst into tears, explaining through her sobs that Liam had just insulted the JFK of her generation. Remarkably, she was referring not to Kurt Cobain, but to the dopey, hapless lead singer of Pearl Jam. "You stupid loser corporate twats," I chipped in helpfully at the young couple. A full-scale scrap was avoided only by the arrival of the tour bus, but the Nirvana sad cunt quote was to dog Oasis over the next few months. Noel asserted that Liam had been wrong, adding in a public statement, "What can I say? I don't think Kurt Cobain was a sad cunt. I think he was a genius. I think we've lost the John Lennon of our generation." The venue for the New York gig was called Wetlands, a small agitprop place complete with camper van at the side of the stage, Greenpeace stickers all over the place and a countryside mural painted on the wall behind the stage. The air was heavy with the pervasive smell of patchouli and homemade yoghurt, and Oasis blew the roof off. There was a bona fide New York rock celebrity in the crowd that night, Jimmy Destri from Blondie. At the time, Oasis had agreed to do a version of Blondie's Hanging on the Telephone for a tribute album to New York's most startling pop band. It's a project which still hasn't seen the light of day. So Destri turned up in the dressing room with a bit of paper on which he'd written the chord sequences for the song. Undoubtedly aware of Noel's compulsion for appropriating any loose stitches on rock's rich tapestry and weaving them into cushion covers of his own, he'd scrawled at the bottom of the paper, "Steal these and we'll find you." "Yeah, right," said Noel, adding, once Destri had left, "He's just scared we'll do it better." An economically opportunist byproduct of the US trip was a chance for the band to shoot a video for their soon-to-be-released single, Live Forever. Director Carlos Grasso had decided that it would be part live performance, part vignettes. Noel: "Vignette? Isn't that something you put on a salad?" And so, for a couple of days, the band trekked around Alphabet City, participating in plenty of studiedly wacky scenarios, including Liam sitting in a chair nailed 20 feet up a wall. I was shitting myself. And the rest of the band burying Tony alive in a sandpit with barely concealed psychopathic enthusiasm. The performance took place in a bandstand in Central Park, under the shadow of the Dakota Building. The band took advantage of the setting in order to make a pilgrimage to the John Lennon Imagine Memorial, and took great pleasure in imagining Yoko Ono watching the whole video shoot from her window. The next day, they had to fly straight back to England. Despite their expressions of ambivalence about success in America, you could sense a kind of grudging satisfaction at the events of the previous day. "It's all going to plan," Noel told me. I know that we're flavour of the month, of the year, or whatever, but to be honest, this is exactly what we always saw was going to happen. I know exactly what we're going to be doing right up until Christmas. We wanted to get the album out and to release a single every 3 months. After Live Forever, we're putting out Cigarettes and Alcohol. And then at Christmas, a song called Whatever. That one is going to be top 5, no problem. It was to make number 3 in Christmas week, and a few friends who'd been equally seduced by Noel's unshakable confidence cleaned up at the bookies. Oasis flew back to England, back to the increasing unreality, to a country gagging for them. Right from the off, it had been obvious that Live Forever would be a big hit. One of the earliest songs Noel wrote for the band, it was written for his mother, but tapped into a universal celebration of life. I don't write songs that make you scratch your head and say, "What's that all about then?" Noel maintains. I write songs that you hear once and they get straight in your head. I just keep it simple. The cover of the single, released on the 25th anniversary of the day the Beatles put out Abbey Road, featured John Lennon's Auntie Mimi's house in Liverpool. Parallels between the Lennon-Mimi and Noel-Peggy relationships aren't to be avoided. Live Forever? Yeah, some things do. Finding a few spare days, and with Live Forever still in the top 10, they decided to make a video for the next single, Cigarettes and Alcohol. The site for the shoot was the Borderline, a shoebox-sized venue off Charing Cross Road in London's West End. Word had got out about the video, as these things always seem to do among the more dedicated fans, and a few hundred kids wearing regulation Oasis t-shirts had been waiting outside since noon. By early evening, most of them were still there, offering cash beyond their means to anyone with a ticket. By the time it got dark, you couldn't move inside. And all this for just a video shoot. Live performance has always provided the focus for Oasis videos, and this one was no exception. Exciting in theory, but rather losing its appeal when you have to watch the same song being mimed a couple of dozen times. To their credit, both band and fans managed to keep up the impression that they were part of some spontaneous new pop thrill, even after the director had given up the "OK, just one more time" pretense and settled instead for just playing the track over and over and over again. Before they started, and in between takes, a lone cameraman wandered around doing the handheld thing, visibly recoiling as he stumbled into a Dionysian tableau in the dressing room. There, the wannabe groupies were out in force, and the band were having fun with them. As part, no doubt, of some method-acting approach to the enterprise, determinedly working their way through Bensons and booze, supplemented by the white lines of the chorus. Well, they might as well. Some of the footage made it onto an uncensored version of the video that can be seen once in a while on late-night continental TV shows that don't much care if they get taken off the air. The girl in the little pink dress who just finished her O-levels probably has her very own copy. In August, they picked up a new fan, Evan Dando, singer and songwriter with the Lemonheads, a US band who'd achieved moderate success with their cover of Simon & Garfunkel's Mrs. Robinson. It was a song Dando had grown to loathe, preferring people to concentrate instead on his very real talent for off-kilter songwriting, numbers like My Drug Buddy. He liked Noel's songwriting, and they wrote a song together called Purple Parallelogram, yet to be released. Dando turned up on the 30th of August to accompany Oasis on tambourine at an acoustic performance in the Marble Arch branch of Virgin Megastore. It was a quirky guest appearance that gave him a cameo in a date that was to enter musical history. The day Oasis released Definitely Maybe, the first album. It was the one that would annihilate expectations. It was everything Oasis had always promised, finally transferring the dynamic of the live performance onto record. The only previous first album to come close in its immediate impact to Definitely Maybe was the Sex Pistols' Nevermind the Bollocks. But Definitely Maybe was no suicide bomb. Instead, it was a demonstration of just how much more Semtex they had at their disposal. A big, beautiful start. Definitely Maybe opens with a consummate Oasis song, Rock and Roll Star, a number which, until recently, always constituted one of the band's rare encores. If you had to distill the hopes and dreams beyond the Oasis attitude up until that moment, you don't need to listen further than the lines that declaim, "Look at you now, you're all in my hands, tonight I'm a rock and roll star." And as you hear it, you know that everyone else is thinking exactly the same thing. Yeah, a rock and roll star. And for 3 minutes, you know how it feels. As with so many of Oasis' songs, the I, you and me are eternally interchangeable. On the vinyl version of the album, there's an extra track called Sad Song, one of the most beautiful things Noel's ever written. He debuted it live on GLR, the London radio station, dedicating it to Alan McGee. I was sitting listening to the radio and I heard him come on, says McGee, and he played this song that was one of the best things I've ever heard. I remember all the nights we'd hung out together in my flat, and I thought, this is about me. I didn't cry, I'm a Scotsman, but it really got to me. The album was released on Tuesday the 30th of August, and within days it had sold over 150,000 copies, making it not only the fastest selling debut album of the 90s, but also arguably the biggest selling debut of all time. It went straight to number one, beating the Three Tenors to the top spot. I'll stand by that album forever, says Noel. It's definitely one of the best first albums anyone has ever done. And it was the first number one for Creation Records. Evan Dando still in tow, Oasis checked into a Heathrow hotel, ready for a flight to their first ever Irish gig. I got back to the hotel, says Noel, and as I walked into the lift, out came Evan with all these police around him. Apparently, he'd gone a bit wild in his room and smashed up the TV set, and they'd come to arrest him. I was like, it's okay, mate, he's with us, we'll pay for it, now let him go. And they did. Next day, he continues, we got to the airport and everyone was putting the bags through the metal detector. Suddenly, alarms started going off. All these guys with guns appeared from nowhere, and the X-ray of Evan's bag made it look like there was a bomb in it. They were convinced he was some sort of major terrorist. Anyway, they open his bag, and inside there's all these bits of metal and glass and wires. It's the remains of the TV he smashed up the night before. He's way out there, man. You've just got to stand back. Completely mad. That night's gig in Dublin was an emotional experience for Liam and Noel, a return to their Irish roots, and the first time they'd ever played there. Oasis have, in the past, defined themselves as Irish, an impassioned if not completely convincing reclamation of their roots. At times, it seemed to have been spawned more from a desire to be awkward than anything else. But peel back the Manx Scally facade, and you start to comprehend the instinctively isolationist impulse that drives much of Oasis's music. Noel would never admit it, but he lives his life like he's always taking on board a first day at school, the outsider making his mark and, at the same time, confirming his otherness. Every single song that Noel Gallagher writes has traces of his Irish roots smeared between the lines. Dublin was a good gig, but afterwards there was this big queue at the dressing room door, says Noel. It was all our relatives, hundreds of them. They were going, this is your auntie's second cousin, and this is his dog. I think we met half of Ireland that night. They played to an equally ecstatic response in Belfast before flying back home for a nerve-wracking experience. A gig at the Hacienda in Manchester, their first hometown gig since June. Unsurprisingly, there was nervousness in the air, a sense that Oasis still had something to prove. The Scallies were out in force as the doors opened, touting tickets for as much as £100 a shot. An unfortunate choice of word, perhaps, with the Hacienda a notorious playground for the gun gangs from Moss Side and Cheetham Hill. The band played a brilliant, edgy set, a forehead-slapping reassertion that they weren't about to stand politely beneath any kind of Manchester banner, especially if the city's lieutenants had insisted on completely missing the point of everything that Oasis represented. Oasis aren't a Manchester band, they're a band from Manchester. It's much more than a matter of linguistics. When you dive deep into the Manchester business, you need some decompression time before you head anywhere else. And when that anywhere else is Japan, you really ought to take a couple of lifetimes to reacclimatise yourself. Oasis took a week. I told the others not to be too excited about Japan, says Noel. I've been there with Spiral Carpets, and they'd gone down all right, but the audiences were really reserved and polite. I was expecting that we'd turn up there and have a job getting people into us. You were wrong. I was wrong. They should have realised when they found out that the tickets for a 6-date tour of the country had sold out in less than a day. Right from their arrival at Tokyo's Narita airport, it started to get obvious that Noel had drastically underestimated the reactions of every girl within a 200-mile radius. Oasis might have been signed to Sony, but at the time they hadn't released a record in Japan. It didn't stop the fans mobbing them every time they even thought about going outside. It really was one of the weirdest weeks I've ever had in my life, says Noel. There were girls coming up after every show giving us all these presents, really expensive stuff like Beatles rarities that even I hadn't seen before. There was this one girl who followed us round to every gig, all over Japan, and each night she gave me a different bit of Gaultier clothes. By the end of the tour, I had a whole suit, loads of shirts, ties, everything. We had to go out and buy suitcases just so we could fill them with all the stuff they'd given us. For a few magical days, Oasis knew what it was like to have the world revolve around them. It made me realise what Beatlemania must have been like, says Johnny Hopkins. After the last of their 4 sellout gigs in Tokyo, they discovered a place called the Cavern Club and, unsurprisingly, decided to pop their heads in. For 5 hours or so. They were even happier once they found out about the house band, a combo called the Parrots, whose set consisted entirely of Beatles cover versions. Ask Noel about his favourite song ever and he'll tell you it's the Beatles' Ticket to Ride. He likes the way the protagonist thinks he's going to be sad and thinks it's today. And most of all, like he said, he loves the way you know just before it happens that there's going to be a chord change. He's consistently, perhaps understandably, resisted doing a cover version of Ticket to Ride. In Japan, he did record a cover of You've Got to Hide Your Love Away, though available on import versions of Some Might Say, and played for one day only on Radio 1 on International AIDS Day. If I cover a Beatles song, says Noel, I'm just doing something that someone else has written. When we do I Am the Walrus, we're doing a song that the Beatles never played live, and I think we do it better than they would have done it. We turn it into an Oasis song. With something like Ticket to Ride, it's just a copy. I don't know if I can ever write a song as good, but I'm going to keep on trying. It's the really simple songs that you hear once and think you've known all your life. They're the classics. They're the ones that matter. At their last gig in Tokyo, Oasis played, in their own opinion, better than they'd ever done before. And for the first time, they did an encore. We did that gig in Japan and it was brilliant, says Noel. None of us wanted to go off, so we decided to do an encore. It was the first one we ever did. Tony had thrown all his drumsticks into the crowd, so he had to ask for someone to give him some to play with. We did Rock and Roll Star, because that was what it was all about. That was how I felt. They were indestructible, and even the groupies at the hotel afterwards couldn't take away the feeling that Oasis could do anything, that they ruled the world. Next stop, America. You look back, says Johnny Hopkins, and you realise that after Japan, America was going to be a complete shock. And how? Seattle went well. The band's still high on their Southeast Asian excursion, a euphoria that was to carry them through to the next date in San Francisco, and the first suggestion that the American record business wasn't just going to settle for the self-confident swagger that had always worked before. The superficiality that had fluttered around the edges of their previous American trip suddenly careered centre stage, making it clear that if Oasis didn't play by American rules, they could kiss goodbye to US success. Everyone tried to confront the situation the only way they knew how, by getting completely blasted. Bonehead's brother Martin lived in LA, and his gaff seemed as good a place as any to start a search for the self-belief that had got them so far in the first place. Even now, they won't admit they were scared, but after Japan, it was obvious that America was going to do their heads in. They got themselves a slot on their old buddy Rodney Bingenheimer's show on K-Rock, bizarrely overlapping with a problem phone-in and finding themselves having to offer advice to jilted lovers. Bonehead's cunning plan never wavered. Sue, he said. Just sue. Just about everyone who rang up was urged to scurry away to a lawyer immediately. One guy rung in asking about penis extensions. We've got a penis extension, said Noel. He's our drummer. Getting steadily more wasted, the band headed over to Johnny Depp's club, the Viper Room, and almost inevitably ended up getting thrown out. The party moved on to Bonehead's brothers, and sometime round dawn, the LAPD arrived, cautioning them about disturbing the peace. By then, Noel had snatched a few hours' sleep, and the rest of the band had been up for 72 hours, just to see what would happen. They found out that night at the Whiskey A Go-Go, one of LA's most famous venues and a perfect showcase for Oasis. Even Ringo Starr turned up to check the Beatles aficionados he'd heard so much about. He must have wished he'd stayed at home. The gig was a complete shambles. No one knew what songs they were supposed to be playing. When they eventually did start on one, they were a mess. Liam started baiting the audience. Noel started fighting with him, and during I Am the Walrus, walked off stage. I was disgusted by what had happened, says Noel. It was complete shit. I said to the others, I don't want to do this if you're not going to put everything you've got into it. If you're gonna fuck around, then do it when we've finished with the band. We'll have plenty of time then, but right now I'm gonna be in a group who want to do something. No one said anything, so I thought, that's it. Fuck it, we're splitting up. I took all the money from the tour float and got on the first plane out of LA. I had half an ounce of coke with me and I thought, right, I'm having this, then I'm going home. It's over. He went to Las Vegas and San Francisco, increasingly paranoid and convinced that the FBI were tapping his phone. I really was ready to go back home, says Noel, but in the cab to the airport I was reading a Melody Maker or something and I saw an advert for all these Oasis gigs in England and they were sold out. Anyway, I thought that if I'd been one of the people who bought tickets and the band had cancelled, I'd have thought Oasis were complete cunts. We played loads of gigs in Britain, but this was going to be the first really big tour. I knew I should go back to the others and we should sort it out. Honestly, he continues, after that gig, I really didn't want to be in Oasis anymore. I couldn't see any good coming out of carrying on. What was happening was completely the opposite of why we'd started in the first place. We were all getting caught up in a lot of madness. They decided to give it another go, but the wounds would take a long time to heal. Noel rang me and admitted that things had been going badly, but laid much of the blame at the relentless meet and greet rituals that the record company expected them to undertake. I didn't come all the way here just to shake hands with some executive knobhead's wife, he complained. And was he friends with the rest of the band again? No, they're all cunts. I flew out for the last 2 dates of the American tour in New Jersey and Manhattan. Their brother Paul had also turned up, trying to blag a job at Sony as soon as the wheels touched the tarmac, along with a sizable Mancunian contingent. During the first half of the New Jersey show, it was obvious that there was still a lot of animosity, none of them even looking at one another, let alone speaking. And something was missing from the sound. It had no heart. Halfway through the set, perhaps inspired by the Brit presence, they started to turn things around, restore some of the old magic. By the time they played Manhattan, again at Wetlands, they got the old spirit back. After the gig, Noel played a song he'd written while on the run. Talk Tonight was the finest thing he'd ever written, a melancholy reflection on his state of mind as he headed for Vegas, full of allusions to a girl he'd met in San Francisco who provided some sort of redemptive presence. I may have been completely pissed off, he said, but it wasn't going to stop me writing songs. Nothing ever will. Oasis came back to Britain to find Cigarettes and Alcohol at number 7 in the charts, their biggest hit so far. The closing months of the year were spent touring extensively in Britain and Europe, consolidating both their renewed vigour and their ever-growing popularity. Definitely Maybe top charts right across the continent, as well as notching up healthy sales as far away as Australia. They were fast shaking off any appearance of just another indie band, crossing over at last into mainstream success. They even managed to duck the censors with the lyric on Cigarettes and Alcohol about how you might as well do the white line. You have to give radio stations the lyrics, says Noel, so we just said Liam was singing You Might As Well Do the White Lime. We made up some story about how the whole song was about eating fruit, and they believed us. At a gig at Glasgow's Barrowlands, Liam's voice finally gave out and he stormed off stage, leaving Noel to take over for the rest of the set. The audience started to get angry. A riot was just about avoided, but not before promises were given to reschedule the gig. It did, however, re-emphasise Noel's growing vocal confidence. Like everyone else, he understood that no one could ever dominate a stage quite like Liam, but it made him increasingly confident of handling vocal duties on more of the songs. In December, Oasis released their 5th single in 9 months and only just missed out on a Christmas number 1. Whatever was the song that Noel had written almost 2 years earlier and promised would be top 5 at Christmas '94. That he was right was almost taken for granted, such was the confidence in the Oasis camp. It made number 3, beaten only by E17 and Mariah Carey, and the difference in sales was just a matter of a few thousand. The band ended the year with 2 big gigs in Brighton and Middlesbrough. At the former, Liam found himself a new, if annoying, admirer. Paula Yates latched onto him at a party after the gig and wouldn't let him out of her sight, causing him to conclude, "That woman is completely mad. I keep on telling her to fuck off, but she won't listen." The next day, on the wall behind her bed on the set of The Big Breakfast, Paula had stuck a photo of Liam up. Perhaps he hadn't made his point clearly enough. In fact, it was another admirer that was to prove rather more enduring. At a gig in Cambridge a month earlier, Chrissie Hynde from The Pretenders had brought a friend along to see the band and meet Liam afterwards. He and Patsy Kensit hit it off right from the start. I recall a late-night conversation with Liam in a hotel bar sometime earlier. I asked him whether he'd ever been in love. No, he replied. Only this close, and he spread his arms as far apart as he could to elaborate. The thing about love, he said, is that some people think it's like the Derby, when in fact it's like the Grand National. Liam knew that if he was going to make any relationship work, he'd have to learn to deal with a whole load of obstacles, and he wasn't going to fall in love until he knew he'd been able to deal with them. If 1994 had been hectic, the new year didn't look like being any different. Marcus and the band were convinced of the importance of maintaining the momentum that had built up, particularly in America, so the band spent the first 4 months of the year building up the transatlantic air miles and finally beginning to see their persistence paying off. Back home, the awards were starting to roll in. At the Brits, they picked up Best New Band, although they felt they ought to have won more. Their frustration was compounded by the fact that Blur swept the board, although to their credit, the latter did suggest in their acceptance speech that their Best Band award should have been shared with Oasis. Oasis should have taken the olive branch and responded with some sort of grace, but such was the single-mindedness at the time that they saw no space for compromise or conciliation. You were the best or you were nothing. Oasis were more successful at the enemy-sponsored Brat Awards, picking up Best Band, Best New Band and Best Single for Live Forever. Noel's acceptance speech acknowledged the importance of the support of the fans, but he also made sure he got a few indiscriminate insults in towards most of his peers, claiming that every other band present was crap. Afterwards, a few of us went back to Noel's place. In fact, Johnny Marr had let him use his home in Fulham, a gorgeous flat that impressed on Noel the kind of luxury that accompanies real success. Noel was raving about a new song he'd written and played a rough demo tape. A stirring pop song, one of the most self-contained, complete things he'd yet come up with. Before he played the tape of the new song, I jokingly asked him what he'd ripped off this time. He didn't even pause. Ooh La La by The Faces. It's a top tune. The song was Some Might Say, and it was finally to give Oasis their first number one. We were lost. Completely. Photographer Tom Sheen and I had been invited to Loco Studios in South Wales, where Oasis were to record their single Some Might Say. Unfortunately, we'd trusted our safe passage to a cab driver with apparently even less local knowledge than we had. After a mere 4 or 5 hours, we finally located Loco Studios, hidden behind a hedge and signposted merely by a small pile of white stones. The studio itself is a kind of technological TARDIS, contained in what looks like a converted folly, complete with accommodation, a treehouse, and the sort of views guaranteed to unblock even the most bunged up of creative impulses. I love the countryside, I'm mad for it, announced Liam as soon as we arrived. Hardly what you'd expect of a child of the city, a 24-hour party person with a notoriously low boredom threshold. But what would he find to do? I wondered. I'd get a full-length mirror, stand in front of it, and have a ruck with myself. Cities do me head in. He still had 3 days recording to go. Much of the instrumental work had already been done, and Bonehead, Gwiggs and Tony were ready to head back to Manchester. Liam would stay to record his vocals, just as soon as Noel had finished writing them. Then Noel and producer Owen Morris would tinker with things until they'd found the perfect Oasis sound. There'd be arguments, obviously. For a moment at least, though, they were buzzing at the very real prospect of achieving the full-blown success they'd promised for so long. A show of strength that would lift them above the level of mere indie chancers. This atmosphere of solidity was enhanced by the presence of Bonehead's 8-week-old daughter, Lucy Oasis. Noel's the godfather, revealed Bonehead's fiancée, Kate, prompting the thought that the poor child was destined to receive birthday gifts of guitars and Beatles bootlegs for the rest of her days. No, said Kate, he's really good. He's got lots of fluffy toys and things. Not that Noel had entirely forsaken his musical enthusiasms. He showed me the plectrum he was going to use to play the guitar lines on Some Might Say, an ultra-rare Beatles souvenir with George Harrison etched on it. Top, eh? He said. It's going to be the inspiration. He also revealed that he'd solved the problem of what other songs were going to go on the single, playing me first a track called Acquiesce. The title had already been used by the highly literate Elvis Costello acolyte Amy Mann, but it's not the sort of word you'd expect the determinedly direct Noel Gallagher to use. I was watching the O.J. Simpson trial on TV and it came up in that, he revealed. I didn't have a clue what it meant, but it sounded a dead good word. I looked it up, and it said it meant being dragged into something no matter how hard you try and resist, like the Pied Piper or something. It seemed pretty apt for Oasis. People hear us, and they acquiesce. Acquiesce remains one of the most extraordinary songs Noel has ever written. Not just because of its inherent rock and roll quality, but because it's one of the few Oasis songs to address, albeit ambiguously, the relationship between the Gallagher brothers. The "we need each other, we believe in each other" chorus could easily be a straightforward boyfriend-girlfriend litany, but it's tempting to see it as the closest the Gallaghers have ever got to a sort of fraternal "I've got you, babe." As Noel waited to play the new mixes to Liam, he mused on the state of their publicly stormy relationship. "Hey man, I love him, he's my brother. It's just that we don't bottle things up. If we get pissed off with each other about something, we just get it out in the open, punch each other and get over it. I mean, I get pissed off if his voice fucks up, but I know it's only because I've been working so hard and his voice needs a rest." I wonder whether Noel really understands Liam, knows what makes him tick. He told me in Wales that the two of them were very different in their most basic of impulses. I haven't a clue what he's really thinking. It's like he's at war with the world, but I don't know why. There's something really getting to him, but I don't know what it is. He's always questioning everything, looking for answers. With me, it's like life's just a load of questions. If I don't find the answers, then fuck it, they'll turn up later on. Our kid doesn't want that. He just wants to know all the answers right now, this minute. Before recording his vocals, for some might say, Liam went off into Newport for an afternoon's drinking and shopping session. He returned after an extensive pub crawl. "Do you think we go anywhere after we die?" he asked himself as much as anyone else, demanding that everyone within earshot witness him running through the options. "I live for now, not for what happens when I die," he shouted, cigarette in one hand, Jack Daniels in the other, pacing up and down with that familiar pimp roll walk. "If I die and there's something afterwards, I'm going to hell, not heaven. I mean, the devil's got all the good gear. What's God got? The inspiral carpets and nuns. Fuck that." As evangelical agnosticism goes, you'd be hard pushed to find a more convincing argument. I wondered what his epitaph would be. He didn't even blink. "When I die," he said, "I want them to write on my grave, 'Don't fucking come here with your bunches of flowers.' I don't even want a gravestone. I want a V sign, 2 fingers, a really fucking huge V sign, 20 foot tall or something. When you're dead, you're dead. It's now that matters. At war with the world, even in the afterlife." Over the 3 days I spent with them in Wales, they seemed to do most of the recording in impulsive bursts. They did take time off to watch The Word on TV. A clip of their first performance on the programme won the viewers' vote for the footage they most wanted to see again, attracting 28% of the registered votes. "That meant a lot to me," Noel admitted the next day. "I've never done what I do for anyone else, but, you know, those people who rang in, it proved we're right." "You're wrong. That's shit." That's Liam. Sitting at the mixing desk, he'd just heard the putative first mix of Some Might Say. "It's not shit, it's great," replied Noel. "No, it's not. It's shit. It's weird." "It's meant to be weird." "Yeah," says Liam. "Weird to everyone else, not to us." "What do you think?" Liam asked, turning to me and put him in perhaps the least enviable position in the whole world, in the middle of an argument between the Gallaghers. I thought about pretending to be either mute, French, or dead. In the end, I just coughed for ages, until they both got bored and went outside to push each other around for a bit. Finally, Noel returned to twiddle more knobs with producer Owen Morris. Liam and I went off for a drink. "See what happened then?" he said. "That's what happens all the time. That's why people say we're always fighting. I'm just standing up for myself. He thinks it's his band and we're all supposed to be sheep. The rest of them go along with it, but I'm not going to. I mean, if he told them all to turn up tomorrow because we were going to play a gig under a lamppost, they'd just do it. It's like when Bonehead's girlfriend was pregnant," he continued. "If I'd find out my girlfriend was pregnant, I wouldn't have gone on the tour. I'd have just said, fuck it, there's more important things. We're not just old Bartholomew's backing band like he sometimes thinks. I mean, he wouldn't have joined if I hadn't been there in the first place. I wrote 3 songs back then, and I admit 2 of them were shit. The other one was alright though. And I wrote the chorus to Columbia. I'm not useless, and I'm going to start proving it. I've given up the pot, and I'm cutting back on the boozing. You waste so much time when you're just pissed and lazy. I'm going to learn to play the guitar properly and write some songs." And would Noel welcome the creative input from him? No, of course he fucking wouldn't. It's like when we were on the last tour, I had an idea for backing vocals on one of the songs, but when I told him, he just went, "No, that's shit. Then, when we did the song, he started doing backing vocals, just like I'd said. I went, I told you that'd be good. But he went, no, they were different backing vocals. He's just too proud to admit that I'm right sometimes. I just wish he'd remember sometimes that Oasis is a band. And, for 10 minutes at least, I suddenly found myself in that band too. As the alcohol and pharmaceuticals helped to dissipate tensions, Noel suggested that we all help out with hand claps. So a motley crew, including me, the band's press officer Johnny Hopkins, Oasis sleeve photographer Michael Spencer-Jones, designer Brian Cannon and a girlfriend of Liam's called Kadamba, trooped into the studio to clap along to no more than 10 seconds of music, which would then be looped throughout the song. A seemingly simple task, but one which found us plumping for a passable impersonation of a group of disorientated performing seals. A couple of hours later, producer Owen Morris finally pronounced himself satisfied, presumably to avoid further damage to his forehead from banging it on the mixing desk in frustration. Back upstairs, Noel and Liam were embarking on a kind of scrap by proxy as they watched the Ben McClellan boxing match. Before they had time to recreate the fight in the corner, Morris returned to play the final mix of Some Might Say. 4 minutes later, most of us were conclusively convinced that it would provide the band with their first number one. The original demo had been beefed up, layered with a glorious affirming noise, but still shot through with an irresistible melodic brilliance. Yeah, number one. The only person who didn't seem surprised poured himself a drink. Yeah, of course it'll be number one, said Noel. That's what it's there for. Monday the 17th of April 1995. The band's first full-length UK show of the year. Sold out since the dog end of winter and ticket touts charging upwards of £50 a pop. The name Oasis, marked out in lights across the front of Southend Cliffs Pavilion, shone across the bay with a neat classicism far removed from the gaudy fairground and fish bar vulgarity a few hundred yards down the coast. It defined a dizzying future rather than tarted up an increasingly unreal past. It was a marvellous, grubbly bacchanalian atmosphere, but somehow blurred the focus of the performance by Oasis themselves. Sure, there was power and passion, thunder under the lighting, but there was also a messiness to the proceedings, a sense of some cult religion not yet fully focused, torn this way and that by mere bluster. It didn't help that the gig was being filmed. The audience, many of whom memory insists were actually eating chips, filled the gaps between songs with football chants and drunken psychobabble. No bad thing in itself, but not best appreciated by an already obstreperous Oasis. The internal cracks in the band that were to come to a head a few days later ensured that they'd spend much of the set sniping amongst themselves. But then, as they've done so often, they somehow turned it around. By the time they concluded with the by now obligatory I Am the Walrus, they'd even redirected the crowd's energies into wide-eyed approval. Or maybe it was just the drink. In the dressing room afterwards, the white lines racked out and the alcohol flowing like Niagara, the band seemed pleased to have got the year's first show out of the way. Happier yet that their fan base appeared now to have risen into the thousands. There was an impromptu party in the venue afterwards, then the band left, ready for the next leg of the jaunt. As they set off, Liam was arguing with Tony, the drummer. It was an argument that would never end. Thursday the 20th of April, Paris. Although you wouldn't have known it by the coachloads of scallies from Liverpool, Manchester and London who barged through the doors of the Bataclan Club. Not that the British contingent made up the whole audience. By then, Oasis had already built up healthy sales in France of Definitely Maybe. The record company presented them with silver discs in the dressing room beforehand, and Whatever, only just released over there, was already in the top 5. Hence, a voluble, enthusiastic young Parisian presence, with just about everyone joining in with every word. It was one of the greatest gigs Oasis have ever played, perhaps because they all knew it was a final goodbye to small venues, a farewell to having to be defined by anyone else's ideas of what was possible. From here on in, they were going to start writing their own rule book. In the hotel bar afterwards, a quick drink appeared to have all the makings of total madness, until a fight broke out between Liam and Tony. The argument that had been simmering, certainly for days, more probably for months, was concluded when the singer of the greatest rock and roll band in the world punched out the drummer. Noel, cranked up on industrial quantities of Pro Plus, headed off to his room. I've got a song to finish, he told me. I was listening to this John Lennon bootleg, and it's got this great line about, the brains I had went to my head. I'm having that. What, you're just going to nick it? Well, yeah, it'd be a shame to waste it. The song's going to be a classic. Saturday the 22nd of April. Sheffield Arena is one of those huge purpose-built venues that lie on the outskirts of nearly every major British city. With over 10,000 people, it was Oasis's biggest gig to date, and a hint of just how big they were about to become. Inside the venue, Oasis mania had reached fever pitch. The gig started at full pelt and didn't let up for close to 2 hours. It also featured the first example of Noel's now regular solo acoustic slots. Perched on a stool, he played a couple of already recorded Oasis songs, then announced, "This is a new song I wrote in Paris on Tuesday. It's for you, Mathur, 'cause you haven't heard it yet." The song was Don't Look Back in Anger, the most mature thing Gallagher had yet written. And sure enough, he'd nicked the Lennon line about "You said the brains I had went to my head." "I told you I would," he said later. The backstage party found a functional dressing room converted into what seemed like a Turkish opium den. Everybody in the band seemed ecstatic, apart from Tony. That was definitely the end of something, Bonehead told me at the time, and the beginning of something else. I think Tony knew it was the last gig he'd ever play with the band. It'd be a fortnight before the news broke to the general public, but it was obvious that night that he was right. Tony was out, and with only a fortnight until the release of, some might say, the record that was to be their first #1, they needed to find a new drummer. And fast. "Some week, eh?" said Noel. "Yeah, some week." Noel wanted a drummer he thought would be able to do justice to the new songs he'd written, and approached a guy called Alan White, the brother of Paul Weller's drummer, Steve. "I'd never met him," says Noel, "but I'd heard he was good, so I thought, well, I'll meet him and check him out. I'd arranged to meet him in this bar in Camden, and on the way there I thought, what if he's some ugly 30-stone bastard? I saw him coming towards me though, and I thought, thank fuck, he looks normal. So I just said, 'Right, mate, you're in.' And he's going, 'Well, don't you want to hear me play?' I just said, 'No, mate, you're not 30 stone. You look all right. Do you want the job? Right, now, here's a copy of the single. Learn the drums for it and you're doing Top of the Pops with the band tomorrow.' It was as easy as that." Alan White, born and raised in London, had been drumming for years in various small-time bands, but never achieved anything like the profile of his brother. Nevertheless, Alan's enthusiasm was also accompanied by a very real talent, and one which was to make an important contribution to the development of the Oasis sound. Amazingly, despite the rapidity of his audition, he's never been daunted by his role. The second gig I ever did was at Glastonbury. After that, everything else is a piece of piss. White also gives a whole new dynamic to the group. As well as being perfectly capable of drinking and partying along with the best of them, he exudes a sense of quiet stability that reinforces the band's increasing sense of solidity. Plus, he's a Cockney and no part of the Manchester image that's often hindered the band more than it's helped. In early May, after a triumphant Top of the Pops performance, they headed to the Rockfield studio in Wales for 5 weeks to record the second album. Within a couple of weeks, much of the album had been recorded, including the forthcoming single, Roll With It, recorded first take as Noel emerged blearily from a major drinking session. As so often before, however, a protracted period of creativity wasn't going to pass by without a swerve towards catastrophe. That came when Noel arrived back at the studio one night to find Liam hosting a full-scale party. "There was like half of Monmouth in there," says Noel, "everyone completely off their faces. I didn't know who any of the people were and they were all just running around the studio. And there's people playing with me guitars, 30 grand's worth of stuff, and that's right out of order. Liam's going, 'We're just having a drink, but I wanted them all to fuck off. Me and our kid got in a fight and I hit him with a cricket bat. Then I said, "Can anyone drive?" Alan went, "I can." So I said, "Come on, you're driving me back to London. We're in the middle of making a great record and I can see it going completely off the rails." After a week chilling out away from the madness, he returned, forcefully reminding the others that they'd got so close to genuinely colossal success that to throw it away now would be the most stupid thing they'd ever do. Finally, at the end of July, the album was cut at, where else, Abbey Road Studios, and the band prepared for a summer of big-time performances around the country. First major event was Glastonbury, where they'd been so successful the year before. Noel had the cold sweats and insisted on walking around in the blazing heat in a fully toggled up duffel coat and a pair of shiny shoes, gloriously unsuited to the Greenfield site. He spent much of the time with his new best mate, Robbie Williams, at that time still with Take That. The two hit it off immediately, and Robbie was photographed drinking and smoking a spliff. It was to prove to be both his undoing and his salvation. The gig was largely a reminder that the band were as capable as anyone else of right royal cock-ups. 2 songs in, and Liam invited everyone present, all 100,000 of them, up for a fight. One disaffected punter insisted on lobbing 24 eggs at the stage, although none hit the target. That the whole thing was going out live on Channel 4 didn't help much. The band did manage to turn it around a bit by the end of the set, particularly after Robbie had jumped on stage to dance along. "I got my picture in the papers," says Robbie, "and when I went to see the others in Take That a few days later, they said they'd had a meeting and they didn't think my behaviour was how someone in the band should behave. That's when they sacked me. I'm glad I did it though. Meeting Oasis completely changed my attitude to what I was doing and what I wanted to be. It freed me from a lot of things." A good day for Robbie perhaps, but for the band a major stumble. Maybe they weren't really as big as their imagination had insisted. "We just fucked up," says Noel, "but I knew we could still do it. I always like playing the big gigs better than the small ones. I don't like the audience being too close." The next 2 gigs were under canvas at Irvine Beach in Scotland. 2 successive nights playing to 6,000 people. Performances which even now stand out as among the best shows they've ever done. Afterwards, the band embarked on a marathon drinking session, which ended with Liam punching a ceiling and storming off, while Noel conducted an alcoholically crippled interview with Miranda Sawyer, a journalist from The Observer. Still buzzing from the gig, he confessed, "I stare at hotel walls and wonder to myself, where did it go right?" It was when he started ranting about Blur that he said something he was to regret. "The guitarist, I've got a lot of time for," he confessed. "And the drummer, I've never met him, but I hear he's a nice guy. The bass player and the singer, I hope the pair of them get AIDS and die because I fucking hate them." Immediately he'd said it, he tried to retract it, but it was too late. When the comment was printed, it seemed to confirm the completely erroneous image of the band as typical mank homophobes. And by that time, the battle between Blur and Oasis would have even made it onto News at 10. In early August, Paul Weller played the Tea in the Park festival, and Noel decided to hang out with him. He'd checked into the same hotel as me, and when I met him in the foyer, he promised to play me an advance tape of the album later. At 10:30, there was a phone call. "It's Noel. Come down to the lobby now." As I got out of the lift, Noel, his girlfriend Meg, Robbie Williams and their friend, the singer Lisa Moorish, were standing by the doors. Doors stormed 10 seconds later by hundreds of Take That fans. We ended up at Lisa Moorish's elegantly discreet hotel and, after the obligatory lines, Noel put the Morning Glory tape on. He'd later described the record as like half of it's in a hammock smoking a spliff and the other half's walking round the streets of London with a petrol bomb in its hand. That night he was content to insist, "It's the best thing you'll have heard in your life." 3/4 of an hour later, I was inclined to agree. After we'd forced Noel to play the tape of the album a dozen times, Robbie and I headed down to the bar. He opened up about his frustration with Take That, admitting that he'd been writing poems and lyrics of his own for years. I dumbly expected sixth form demonstrations of deficiency, but when he started reciting some of his words, I was blown away. They seemed far more suited to the kind of music being made by Oasis and their contemporaries. I told him as much in the corridor outside the hotel room, and threatened to recite as much as I could remember to Noel. "You can't," protested Robbie. "He's a proper songwriter. What if he thinks what I've written is shit?" "Inside," I said to Noel, "you should hear Robbie's lyrics. They're brilliant. There's one that goes..." "OK," said Robbie, and he read out half a dozen of his songs. When he'd finished, Noel stayed quiet. I started to wonder whether I'd been wrong. "If you don't put those out in a year," said Noel, "I'm having them. They're fucking great, man." Back at my hotel, Robbie, Noel, Lisa and Meg kept the party going. As we got in the lift up to the room, a girl who couldn't have been more than 13 had burst through the security cordon. She stood in front of Robbie and said, "You betrayed the band, you cunt! You're dead!" It was one of the most disorientatingly disturbing moments of my life. A snapshot of success turned inside out and squeezed into a nasty new weapon. Robbie Williams, now very much ex-Take That, gave her the finger. At one point, Robbie was talking about how he hadn't had a day off since he was 16. 5 years of people telling him what he was supposed to do. Now he'd been kicked out of Take That, he felt robbed of confidence, convinced that anyone who'd ever rated him would soon forget that he'd ever existed. The Daily Star's hypocritical revelations about Robbie's lifestyle and his behaviour at Tea in the Park only contributed to his lack of self-confidence. I told him he should start to enjoy himself, asking him how much money he had in the bank. I don't know exactly, he said to me. Think about $1 million. Shit, said Noel, the man who'd done nothing but enjoy himself for the last couple of years. I haven't even got a tenth of that. Within a year, a costly court case would leave Robbie almost penniless, and Noel would have more millions than fingers. Pop and roll shifts shape faster than he could ever imagine. The court case cost a lot of money, says Robbie, but I'm glad I'm doing what I'm doing now. After take that, I'd been told that I was nothing, and I'd begun to believe it. Noel and Liam, though, they're really supportive. They were the ones that made me think, yeah, fuck it, I can do something. Have they been an inspiration? Of course they have. He's a nice bloke, says Noel, describing Robbie, and he's got the right attitude. But he's not joining the band, no matter what rumours you might hear. Top geezer, though. Blur had originally intended to release their new single towards the end of the month, just ahead of the release of their Great Escape album. When, however, Roll With It was scheduled for release on 14th of August, Blur decided to put their single out the same week in direct competition. And the whole affair degenerated into a ludicrous competition between the two that may have garnered a lot of media coverage, but which dragged both groups into an undignified slanging match. People in the creation camp tried to interpret the whole affair as some sort of daft class war, whereas Blur weren't any less cockeyed in resorting to accusations that Oasis were just a 90s version of status quo. Radio DJ Chris Evans played Roll With It over the phone to Blur's Damon Albarn in a hotel room in Glasgow, and Albarn responded by singing Quo's Rockin' All Over the World over the top of it. Oasis immediately put out their own t-shirts, emblazoned with the word Quoasis. When, on the 14th of August, the two singles were released head-to-head, the whole thing merely served to emphasise the manipulative vagaries of chart assault marketing. Oasis had a larger fan base than Blur and were expected to just beat their rivals to the top. When the result was finally revealed, though, Blur were in the top spot, and the recriminations started. In fact, Blur had got to number one simply by releasing their single in a variety of different formats, including 2 CDs with different bonus tracks. The fans, therefore, would have to buy 2 copies. I was really concerned that Noel had this idea that it was all our fault, says Alan McGee, so I went down to see him in the studio. I said to him, "How do you feel?" And he went, "How do you think I feel? I feel like number 2, man." It was obvious that he was really pissed off with us. After I'd told him about the whole format thing, though, I think he realised that it wasn't our fault. I don't think anyone came out of that whole Blur versus Oasis thing very well, but if anyone started it all, it was Blur. On the 5th of September, Noel went into Abbey Road Studios to record an acoustic version of Fade Away with friends Lisa Moorish and the actor Johnny Depp for the charity album Help. Artists all over the country were recording in studios on that day, the aim being to gather together all the tracks and have a finished album out within the week, all profits to go to help the people of Bosnia. Tony Crean was the man with the original idea for the album, and to their credit, all the acts involved did justice to the nobility of Crean's vision, the album ultimately raising enough money to make a very real difference to the lives of a lot of Bosnians. Paul Weller was due to record a track and asked Noel to help out. The two already had a history of working together that went back to Weller's previous Stanley Road album, when Noel had played guitar on a cover version of Dr. John's Walk on Gilded Splinters. Paul Weller played on Morning Glory, further emphasising the bond between him and Noel. As well as harmonica on Swamp Song, he also threw in guitar, harmonica and backing vocals on Champagne Supernova, the track that Noel had conceived as a stairway to heaven for the 90s, without all the elves and cosmic shite. "It was weird when I started to get friends with him and we hung out together," says Noel. "He'd been sitting there all night while I asked him millions of questions about the jam. If anyone had told me 5 years ago that I'd be friends with him and playing on one of his albums, I'd have been, yeah, right, fuck off." At Abbey Road, though, his wildest dreams were just about to come sashaying in. As befitting the location, a plan was made to do a cover of the Beatles' Come Together. Suddenly, the doors opened, and in came Paul McCartney with his wife Linda, ready to play. And so, under the banner Mojo Filters, the pictures on Gallagher's bedroom wall all those years before came down to give him a smile he still hasn't entirely wiped off his face. In Japan, that summer of '95, their 7 gigs had sold out in hours. Fans were only too happy to oblige the band's every whim, which included a narcotic supplement to the endless drinking. Liam's voice was shot to pieces, and sleep deprivation had kicked in all round. But immediately after the tour, they were obliged to halt their forthcoming product in various European cities. By the time they reached Paris, the wheels that had spent so long trying to control a joyride around the global car park finally came loose. A live interview at a Parisian radio station had been ruined when Liam decided that having comedian Eddie Izzard was some sort of slight on a perceived notion of Oasis as all-conquering. He walked out and ended up getting punched by the band's tour manager Ian Robertson. As the night wore on, Liam got stroppier than ever, laying into Gwigs for something that only the ice cubes in the triple shot of JD will ever know. Liam Gallagher is, by some distance, the most complex person I know, and also the most spiritual. While he's undeniably guilty of regularly shitty behaviour, he's precociously aware of life's thunderously intangible subtleties. His headlong barrelling into a celebration of life all too often muddles the initial impulse, concentrates on the fact that he's done the lines rather than appreciating that he's spotted the sparkles between them as well. He goes for it, vindicated by his youth and an acknowledgement from those within a worldwide radius around him that he's an iconic personification of the classic rock and roll star. And when he's wrong, you can't expect him to admit it until the speedway inside his head has slowed sufficiently to reveal the world outside as more than just an impressionistic blur. Gwigs knew what Liam was like and understood that words were just words. That night in Paris, though, he'd suddenly felt that maybe he couldn't put up with it anymore. There was a weariness he'd not previously experienced, a fast-forward flash about having to go through it all again, night after night, on the 12-berth tour capsule dragging itself across America's highways. He pulled out of the next day's interviews and asked for a ticket straight back to London. A few days later, Oasis told the world that Gwigs had left the group for a bit because of nervous exhaustion. He'd been missing from the forthcoming British and American tours while he sorted himself out. At first, I thought it'd be a real relief, says Gwigs, but then I got home and just hung around, and it was the most boring time of my life. I knew I was going to go back. The rest of the band knew as well, or at least maintained to themselves as much as anyone else, that his absence was only temporary. In the meantime, the band had to draft in a replacement, and someone came up with the name of Scott McLeod, bassist with a Manchester band called the Yah-Yahs, a group advised by former Stone Roses manager Gareth Evans. McLeod's technical ability was of less concern than the fact that his appointment would keep things within a group of people that they knew. And Scott, no matter how talented he may have been, was never going to be offered a permanent position. The problems within the band may have seemed important to them, but the kids down at Woolworths were more concerned with something else. Initial reviews for the album Morning Glory were bewilderingly lukewarm, more of the writers expressing disappointment that it wasn't simply a rewrite of Definitely Maybe. There were suggestions that the band were out of the depth, trying to do anything other than straightforward Rama-Lama rock, and that in trying to expand their sound they dissipated their strength. Morning Glory was dismissed as merely ordinary. But those reviews of Morning Glory, they were wrong. I try to defend both the criticisms and the accolades, but deep down, I know where my instinctive allegiance lies. Call me a quisling and give me the light for that Molotov. The press were wrong. Despite the reviews, within 4 days of release, the album had sold almost 250,000 copies, and by the end of the week had notched up 346,000 sales, only 4,000 short of the all-time record held by Michael Jackson's album Bad. By the end of the year, it would have sold over 1,750,000 copies, and by the summer of '96, it had gone platinum 9 times over. The first 5 gigs of the next American tour went really well, especially at Roseland in New York and the Orpheum in Boston, where the crowd seemed to really support a sound that defiantly offered an alternative to the increasingly lazy echoes of grunge. Oasis was singing stuff that came from the heart, and while it might have seemed quaintly odd in Britain, in America it was like torching the president. Saying in interviews with the American press that you don't much care about stateside success is apparently tantamount to buggering your firstborn. When an audience start humming your tunes even after what you've said, you know you're onto something. A week in America had suggested just as much to the members of the band who'd been in America before. Is the big but going to mosey along? What do you think? Of course it is. We played this gig in Pittsburgh, says Noel, and Scott went and sat on the bus afterwards with Margaret, our tour manager. The next day she said, he can't handle it, he's going home. He hadn't said anything to me or anyone else, he was just there one night and gone the next. Cutting short the tour, the band made a cursory appearance on the David Letterman show and flew back to Britain. "Scott rung me when I got back," said Noel. "And he said, 'Look, I think I made a mistake.' I went, 'Yeah, you made a big mistake. Bye.' He let us down, and he wasn't going to get a second chance." By now, Gwiggs had grown tired of his self-enforced redundancy. The recognition of boredom and a short course of Prozac had convinced him there would never be a buzz like the feeling he got from playing with Oasis. He was back, and back for the biggest gigs of Oasis' career. On the 4th and 5th of November, they played Earl's Court, the biggest indoor venue in Europe. Tickets sold out within hours. Oasis casually packing a place that had taken David Bowie 10 years to fill. A couple of weeks earlier, I bumped into Noel at a cast gig at London's Astoria. "You've got to hear the guest list for Earl's Court," he'd said. "Madonna, U2, Elton John, George Michael, McCartney, Pete Townsend, Oliver Reed, Stan Bowles, George Best, Ray Davies, Mick Jagger, Colin Bell, the lot. Everyone's either a genius or an alcoholic, or both. It's going to be brilliant." And he was right. The last show of the year was at Manchester's 9X Arena, and a sign of the regard in which Noel was held by fellow songwriters came when George Michael drove up with a dozen of his friends just to see the show. The partying went on for 2 days, Liam only turning up in London 48 hours later at the recording for Jools Holland's BBC Later show. At the first rehearsal, as the band unveiled their cover version of Slade's Come On Feel the Noise, as well as orchestrally supplemented versions of Wonderwall and Round Our Way, it soon became obvious that Liam's voice was unbroadcastably ragged. He stormed off Jools Holland's stage and straight to the dressing room to sleep, leaving Noel to do the singing for the actual performance. Afterwards, the atmosphere understandably tense, everyone trooped home, in no mood for celebration. It was time for the management to remind everyone that the partying had to calm down for a bit. Wonderwall entered the American Billboard charts at number 21. For 31 years, the Beatles held the record for the highest ever debut entry into the Billboard charts, coming in at number 45 in 1964 with I Wanna Hold Your Hand. In October 95, Edwyn Collins' A Girl Like You had entered at number 42. For Oasis to go in at 21 was a far greater achievement than was perhaps recognised even at the time. And the reason for the success of Wonderwall? Basically because it sounded like the Beatles. Listeners were ringing radio stations asking to hear that Beatles song, genuinely convinced that it was an old song by the Fab Four. Even when they knew it was by Oasis, they still kept on requesting it. The song touched something inside them, something that recalled the straightforward elegance of old songs by the Beatles and their contemporaries. Retro? Maybe. They didn't care. They listened to Wonderwall and they understood. Keep it simple. Remember, keep it simple. Back in Britain at the end of 95, Oasis could look back on one of the most extraordinary years in the history of British pop as a global power. As they prepared for an extended performance on Channel 4's The White Room, they were in understandably high spirits. Afterwards, Creation hosted a Christmas party at the Halcyon Hotel in Holland Park, where they handed the band some very special Christmas presents. Drummer Alan White got a radio-controlled Mini Cooper and the key to a real one, while for Bonehead there was a Rolex, for Liam a guitar, and for Gwiggs membership of a gym. Nothing, apparently, for Noel. "Come outside," said Alan McGee, taking him out into the street. "There's your present," he said, pointing at a chocolate-brown Rolls-Royce Corniche parked outside. For the first time in years, Noel was lost for words. But I can't even drive," he eventually managed. Fortunately, the car came with a chauffeur and a long-term reserved parking space in an underground car park, so he wouldn't have to leave such an ostentatious gift outside his house. McGee had recalled that when the band was starting and someone asked Noel what he wanted out of it all, he'd said he'd love a Rolls-Royce. Considering the turnover that Oasis had brought to Creation, it was the least he could do. 1996 started with Wonderwall still in the charts and reflected success for a couple of Oasis tribute bands, the Gallaghers and No Oasis. Both got the seal of approval from the Real article, particularly the latter, whose gigs Noel regularly attends, "'cause it's like seeing us and I never get a chance to experience that." The band had also established a bond with the Bootleg Beatles, whose tribute act had provided the support at the Earl's Court gigs. Better still, Noel had been hanging out with the real Paul McCartney, having been introduced both at the Help album recording session at Abbey Road and through a friendship with his daughter Stella. "I went round to his house," says Noel, "and he said, 'You remind me a lot of what we were like, the whole look and everything.' I said, 'I should think so, I've spent enough money trying.' Anyway, he'd heard Morning Glory and said he really liked some of the songs. It was a buzz to hear that." One rumour had it that McCartney said to Noel, "You're going to run out of Beatles riffs to rip off before too long," to which Noel replied, "I don't think so, I've got all the bootlegs to get through yet." Sadly, it turns out to be an apocryphal tale, but you won't find Noel too quick in denying it. Morning Glory had already taken up residency in the top 5 in the American album charts and was outselling all opposition in Europe. After a few dates in Germany, the band returned to Britain to play a short British tour before announcing their biggest ever dates, 2 shows at Main Road in April. The 40,000 tickets for the first show sold out in under 2 hours, a similar amount for the second, taking only another couple of hours to do the same. It was obvious that Oasis mania was showing little sign of abating. Not surprising then that a whole heap of awards continued to come their way. At the Enemy Brat ceremony, they picked up 4: Best Album, Best Band, Best Single and Best Live Act, and Noel even ended up with a couple of bizarre animal statuettes for the album from a Finnish magazine. They had pride of place on top of his TV set. The big industry awards are the Brits, and it was no surprise to see them clean up at the ceremony, winning Best Band, Best Album and Best Video for Wonderwall. There was a definite sense of vindication in that they trounced Blur in all categories, and as the night drew on, they took full advantage of both drinking everything within arm's reach and publicly berating all opposition. Arguments ensued with host Chris Evans and backstage with Michael Hutchence, a row that spilled over into the awards ceremony itself. Liam offering to accompany Hutchence outside for a scrap. In accepting their awards, they found time, amid the defiantly obstreperous tomfoolery, to name-check Alan McGee and urge viewers to go out and vote Labour. Leader Tony Blair was there, with his second-in-command, John Prescott. After the awards, Prescott came up to the table where I was sitting with Gwiggs and said to the Oasis bassist, "So, you're the main men I've heard about then?" No one was quite sure what on earth he was on about, but the fact that he recognised them was a source of some pleasure. Michael Jackson's overblown, tastelessly messianic performance at the awards had caused Jarvis Cocker from Pulp to embark on a one-man protest, invading the stage, wiggling his arse and flicking V signs everywhere. Cocker found himself hauled off stage and taken straight to the police station. Later, back at the Landmark Hotel, where Oasis was celebrating the victory with another all-night party in session, Cocker turned up to a hero's welcome. "It was fucking brilliant what he did," Noel enthused. "He should have punched the fucker." In unstoppable mood, they headed back to America for a series of East Coast dates that saw them more enthusiastically received than ever before. Ben Studd of Melody Maker travelled out to see them in Philadelphia and found that the fans saw in Oasis a genuinely new future for the American rock environment. Ben Studd was equally impressed. "The greatest rock and roll band in the world?" he asked at the end of his piece, immediately answering his own question, "I have not a single doubt." Ben's Melody Maker interview with Noel included a quote from the latter about how the band were lads and how their upbringing and background were always going to affect what they did and how they behaved. "We've burgled houses and nicked car stereos and we like girls and we swear and we take the piss," said Noel, making a point with dramatic effect rather than seriously confessing to a life of crime. Nevertheless, reports of his quote resulted in Manchester's police reopening several lines of enquiry into unsolved burglaries in an unbelievably naive or incredibly stupid attempt to hold the band responsible for the city's entire crime figures for the past 5 years. Not that the band were particularly concerned at the furore. When Liam was asked by a Daily Mirror reporter whether there was any truth to the accusations of burglary, he deadpanned, "Yeah, I've done loads. I'm doing your house tonight." A week after the Philadelphia gig, I went to see them in New York for the closing date of the tour. It was a landmark gig. Held at the Paramount, an annex of Madison Square Garden, it had sold out in a matter of hours. Oasis went down a storm. Despite the fact that it was far from being one of the best performances, they could afford to cruise through the proceedings, getting by merely on the strength of the songs and the tornado at their heart that can blow the roof off buildings even when whirling on half strength. A crowd unused to such economic dynamism were left reeling with delight. Next stop, Main Road, the ground of Manchester City's football team. The 2 shows were extraordinary, but the practicalities of organising anything on such a large scale inevitably produced problems. The band had registered bookings at almost every hotel in Manchester to throw fans off the scent, but the roads around the stadium were so jammed that they had to spend most of each day inside the venue itself. Also, an almost non-existent security presence outside the ground meant a field day for the local urchins of Moss Side, most of whom seemed to spend the entire 48 hours in surrounding streets, stealing tickets and trying to sell them on for as much as £300 each. In the quiet moments in between, they whiled away the time throwing stones at anyone passing by. It led to a lot of nasty scenes that could easily have spilled over into a full-scale riot. "I'm a socialist," says Alan McGee, "but it tested even my faith in people. You look at places like that, though, and you see that crime is one of the only ways out. Another is pop music." And in many ways, Oasis are an iconic alternative to those very people with the Stanley knives and their own twist on the entrepreneurial impulse. The lads. One of them even blagged his way into the hospitality area, white cagoules zipped to the neck, moving with the familiar Liam Lope. And 40,000 heads turned in the stadium, thinking it was him, cheering and waving. For a moment, he was Liam. It's the dream at the heart of Oasis's appeal. For 2 nights on stage, Oasis showed just how intoxicatingly majestic that dream can be. Playing better than ever before and holding an aggregate audience of 80,000 people in the palm of their hand. It was one of the most emotionally powerful moments of my life. Both nights were filmed and taped for commercial release as part of their There and Then video. After the triumph, a chance to relax for the first time in 3 years. The band went home to girlfriends, bought houses, chilled out. Noel and Meg moved into a large house in St John's Wood, while Liam moved in with Patsy in preparation for buying a place of his own. And Noel got to fulfil another enduring ambition at the Royal Festival Hall when he sang on stage with his hero Burt Bacharach, his rendition of This Guy's in Love with You, well received by an audience that included Liam. "I was more scared doing that than anything I've ever done before," says Noel, whose dedication to Bacharach is so obsessive that he even possesses a programme for one of the man's 70s shows and takes great delight in revealing that Burt had a pet duck called Quack Quackarack. When you're the biggest band in the world, you're not supposed to take it easy. Stepping back to appreciate everything you've achieved becomes an open invite to all the dumb scavengers, the dickheads who huff and puff and finally get within hailing distance of the opportunity to make a quick buck. As Oasis took a breather, Sony tried to buy out Alan McGee's crucial 2% of Creation's controlling interest, something which would tug ultimate control away from the man who understands exactly why Oasis mean much, much more than just a vehicle for churning out profits. "Oasis mean more to me than just money," says McGee. "Anyone who doesn't love them and have total belief in them doesn't deserve to be involved with anything they do. I told Sony, well, if you want the label, then Oasis and the Primals and everyone else are going to leave. They got the message, and we just renewed the old deal for 5 years, and I walked out with a banker's draft for £14.5 million. You can't try and turn Oasis into some sort of marketing thing. They're more important than that." 3 months off, and the band now prepared to prove it to themselves as much as to the people around them. The snapshots and memories were all very well, but adoration is a hard habit to kick. They had to get back to playing live, just like breathing, but bigger. I'm there to ask questions, get them to tell the archives what they're all about these days, give them somewhere to lob the cockiness. On this occasion, chirpy camaraderie is just about the last thing I feel like initiating, having found out a couple of hours earlier that my friend Rob Collins, keyboardist with the Charlatans, who were due to support Oasis at Loch Lomond and Nebworth, had died in a car crash the previous night. But it's obvious that at least I won't have to endure any tiresome petulance. Everyone in the band is in good shape and seemingly rejuvenated by the time off. They're tanned, comfortable and dressed with that slightly scruffy casualness that only the seriously rich can ever pull off. As Liam stands behind the mic, arms behind his back and mouth singing to the ceiling, I find myself wondering what it is about him that seems to come from somewhere so long ago. Then I realise he's smiling. He's really enjoying it. And so is Noel. Shirt untucked, he's hammering away at a Union Jack guitar, every inch the end of the century mod god. He swaps jokes with Griggs, Bonehead and Alan, all looking like they've remembered why being in a band always seemed so good in the first place. Oasis run through most of the set they intend playing live at the forthcoming shows. Towards the end, they give the first live performances of 2 new songs, My Big Mouth and Getting Better Man, both of which bode well for the 3rd album. Afterwards, there are brief exchanges of condolences about Collins' death, but so close to the time when Oasis are to leap back onto the carousel, it's understandably not something anyone wants to talk about too much. Intimations of mortality can't be allowed to intrude on the optimism. It wouldn't be fair to anybody. "I've just been in Capri," says Liam, "and people used to just come up and shout, 'Autograph!' With Patsy, they'd come up and tell her how beautiful she was. With me, it was just like, 'Sign this.' I was like, 'What about all the 'you're so great' stuff?'" In the past, he would genuinely have been bothered. Nowadays, he's grown up and can actually appreciate the daftness of the situation and of his role in other people's fantasy. "We went on this yellow submarine," he enthuses. "It was brilliant. You go down, you see all these mad starfish and things. I was just sitting there going, 'We all live in a yellow submarine.' It'd be great to do a video on it." As with the rest of the band, it was his first break in ages, and while he enjoyed it, he's keen to play live again. "I'm right up for these gigs," he says. "I've been chilling out, taking it easy, but now I'm ready to go mad again. The gigs are gonna be great." Do you like the celebrity? It's just a job. It's something that I need to do for me. Though, I mean, you can have fun doing anything. It's just something I do, man. And when I'm doing it, I don't remember much about it. All I know is I'm mad for doing these gigs and doing the album and everything. I want to get back into it all again. Are you happy, Liam? Of course I'm happy. What do you think? A couple of years ago, after almost every Gallagher Brothers interview degenerated into argumentative chaos, Noel and Liam decided not to do any more interviews together. Today, however, they've got no qualms about sitting side by side and talking about their immediate future and their recent past. They never even come close to the kind of antagonism that marks so many of their early dual encounters with journalists. So, what have they been up to? "Just taking it easy," says Noel. "Going out, going on holiday, getting fat." Both of them reveal their stomachs, each able to pinch a good deal more than an inch. "That's what success gets you," says Noel. "A really big stomach. Oh yeah, and I've been making lots of money too." A few days earlier, he'd been up in Wales remixing the new single by American loopy post-folk performer Beck. Even a recent holiday in Mustique with girlfriend Meg and celeb friends the actor Johnny Depp and model Kate Moss couldn't drag him away from his guitar. "I wrote loads of stuff for the next album," he says. "Now we're right up for doing these gigs." Any memories of Main Road? The gigs themselves were brilliant. It was just all the shit around it that I hated. Getting the coach to and from the gig and all the gangs outside, that was just a hassle, but I really enjoyed the shows. "The first night was the best," says Liam. "Nah, the second was better," Noel counters. "That was good, but it rained," concludes Liam. No arguments, no fistfights. Grown up at last. Both of them. With all the organisational hassles, why play such large shows in the first place? "Everything's got so big that it's the only thing we can do," says Noel. "I mean, there's 250,000 people who want tickets, and the only way they're going to get them is if we do something like Loch Lomond or Nebworth. And if you make a big event out of it, it becomes really special. They're going to be good gigs. As good as those ones a couple of years back in front of 100 people? Even better. I say that, but to be honest, I can't remember a lot of those old gigs like the 100 Club. I've seen photos and it looked like we were brilliant, but if I try to remember it, I can't. It's just a blank. I'd like to play there again, actually. Maybe we should do a secret tour of lost or little places, like Earl's Court. Or," he continues, warming to the idea, "how about Manchester Boardwalk? Yeah, a 550-night residency at the Boardwalk. That's what we should do." "Anywhere else?" "I'd still like to play Wembley Stadium." Liam splutters. "What? Wembley Stadium is shit. We're not playing there. It'd be a laugh," insists Noel. "Well, you can fucking do it on your own," Liam rightly decides. "There's no way I'm going to play there. It's a dump." The manager, Marcus Russell, comes in. He looks as healthy and relaxed as the rest of them. Obviously, the rest has done everyone in their entourage a lot of good. He tells the band about a gig they've been booked to do in Hawaii. Just a small one, 2,500 people, but Hawaii all the same. It's a poetically neat location to blur the line between work and play, since it was in Hawaii that Alan McGee first heard a tape of Live Forever and decided that he had a world-shaking band on his hands. And it also fulfills a promise that Marcus made to the band when he first tried to convince them to have him as their manager. Noel adopts a cod Welsh accent as he recalls how Marcus sat them down and said, "Sign with me, boys, and you'll be playing Hawaii in 2.5 years, I promise you." He was right, Noel admits, but it took 3 years, not 2.5, so we'll go over and play the gig, then we'll sack him. Hawaii's going to be good, though. It's full of chicks, innit? Oh, yeah, I'm looking forward to going there. Any more ambitions? Musical or personal? Either. Personally, I'd really like to... No, I can't say that. And he swerves from revealing something that it's safe to assume would be gushy, heartfelt and involving Meg. "I can tell you what I'd like to do. I'd like to commit serious bodily harm on someone, and they know who they are." A lot more like the expected public face of Oasis. Anything less, enigmatic? I'd like to learn to drive, get some more money, write some more songs, make some more records, just keep on doing what we've been doing. Liam? Dunno, I'm up for everything at the moment. I want to play some gigs again, buy a house, do the next album, whatever. I wouldn't mind doing some films or some collaborations. That'd be good. Would you make a good actor? I'd be a good painter and decorator. Yeah, Batman or something. I'd be well up for that. We don't make plans so far ahead anymore, says Noel. We can afford to do what we want. Who knows what we'll be doing in 2 years? Probably sitting here with you again, telling you how much things have changed since Nebworth. Any messages for the fans coming along to your gigs? Stand in front of my side of the stage, because I'm the best looking one, says Noel. No way, interjects Liam. Stand at my side of the stage, I'm much better looking than him. Noel spots a technicality. You haven't got a side of the stage, you dick. You're in the middle, remember? OK, well, stand in front of me middle then. I don't know about any messages, says Noel. Come along, have a good time, clap at the end of the songs. Just do what you do at gigs. Everything comes so easy these days. Does that make it harder to come up with records that are actually going to touch anybody? It's all about the songs, says Noel. People are only going to keep going out to buy your records if you've got the songs to back it all up. And we have. There's 15 done for the next album, but I've got loads more ready to go right now. This band has always been about having great songs, and we always will. We're not going to get lazy and just put out a load of shit. Everything we do takes things another stage further than they were before. And with that, they're up and gone. Liam off to see Patsy, Noel off to Camden to buy a Lambretta. Scooters having become almost as enticing a drain on his disposable income as guitars. He's even talked about getting special scooter flight cases made so the band can take them on tour with them. They've got all the trappings of the archetypal rich pop stars, and many groups before them have marked that as exactly the point where things came unglued. Security robbing them of the solidarity and drive that defined their rise to prominence. The moment when your sound gets as flabby as your stomach. I may be completely wrong, but I have an idea Oasis aren't going to fade away quite so easily. The tapes of the next album certainly suggest that it's far too early to start talking of the career being over. They could be just about to embark on the most artistically worthwhile work to date. And then there's still a whole universe of possibilities. When they first got together, there were loads of people ready to tell them they'd never make it. And when they started to sell, almost as many smugly warned they'd never make it in America. The soothsayers of doom are resolutely insisting that no one is ever truly going to match the status of the Beatles or the Stones. This despite the fact that a recent poll established them as more popular than the Beatles amongst under-25s in Britain, while year-end record sales confirmed them as the best-selling rock band on the planet. Oasis are already arguably one of the 10 most important rock bands in musical history, and it's clear that there's still a whole lot more to come. On a personal level, they've given me more pleasure and inspiration than any other group, as people as much as artists, and I'm sure there are an awful lot of others whose life they've changed. It's been a wild 3 years, and I feel genuinely privileged to have been so close to it all. I still tingle every time I see them play live, and I can't imagine a time when their records won't affect me as powerfully as they do. But I'm just as captivated by the possibilities their future still holds as by the worth of what they've already done. Oasis, I thank you, and I'm buzzing for tomorrow.